Well, you guys have been asking for it, so I took the time to put together some of my favorite battle breakdowns for you, and of course, you don't have to watch all of them, although you can grab a drink and some popcorn. I've included timestamps down in the description so you can skip around. We've got battles from every era, but if there's something you'd like to see that wasn't included, let me know down in the comments and maybe for a future video. But let's roll the intro. With that being said, yesterday I picked up the new audiobook release of Shatterpoint. For those who don't know, Shatterpoint is a novel from the perspective of Mace Windu, set during the early years of the Clone Wars. It's very dark and very interesting. We learn about Mace Windu's Shatterpoint, which is basically a unique Force ability which allows him to see how reality is connected and the fissures that can cause things and situations from the human body to the Clone Wars to fall apart. At this point, we're just a few months out from the Battle of Geonosis. Mace Windu is still feeling very guilty about not killing Count Dooku when he had the moment, because in hindsight, he saw that as a chance to end the war before it really began. We get some interesting insight from Windu about the early months of the Clone Wars, and specifically why the Republic, despite having much more territory and influence, was not able to quickly and decisively end the war with a quick invasion against Separatist space, and that's even with the full clone army and new recruits and ships being taken from other planets at all times. So he lists several factors, each of which I'm going to explain and detail. The first is that the Confederacy was prepared for war, and this one is obvious. Palpatine designed the Clone Wars so that the Republic would be forced to militarize in an emergency situation, where the Confederacy, on the other hand, had to come off as a powerful adversary and thus had spent a lot of time secretly upgrading their capital ships, turning their Lucrehulks into battleships, producing secretive armies of war droids, and after the Battle of Geonosis, they were ready for all-out war. The Republic were not only surprised by this war because they weren't expecting it from the Confederacy, they weren't expecting war, period. Sorry for the baby noises. The Republic had seen at this point 1,000 years of peace. It had become ingrained as sort of a central part of their everyday life. Even the Jedi were caught unaware because their ability to see the future began to diminish as the Sith made their reemergence known after the events of the Phantom Menace. Alright, so as I said, the first big factor was the surprise. Next is the control of Separatist space, and this was some really interesting and intelligent tactics from the point of view of the CIS. The CIS had a core of worlds within which were many of their important resources. For example, the book describes secret shipyards hidden in Separatist space pumping out Geonosian dreadnoughts. There were a limited number of hyperspace lanes in the CIS territory, which is true of really anywhere throughout the galaxy, and the Separatists defended these lanes very heavily with droid starfighters and other picket ships. Now, despite the fact that we don't really see this in the movies, the expanded universe describes hyperspace as a much more arduous, long, and difficult process. For example, hyperspace travel would frequently require periods of jumping out of hyperspace, reorienting your ship, and re-engaging hyperspace in order to follow the somewhat complex hyperspace lanes which dictate travel across the galaxy. So the Separatists kept these very highly defended with small mobile fleets, especially droid starfighters. Then they had larger ships in reserve which could come and back up any of the smaller fleets should they so require. However, this strategy only worked because the Separatists were also fighting a strong offensive game, which is the third point. The fact that the CIS had already marshaled a fleet gave them a massive advantage. After the Battle of Geonosis, there were a few months where the Republic did not have a proper response force, and in that time, Separatist fleets spread across the galaxy while the core of the Separatist space was still well protected. And this is why the defensive strategy works. As the Republic built up their military forces, it is true that they could have penetrated Separatist space, but it would have required all-out war and a major allocation of resources. So many resources, in fact, that it would have left Republic worlds vulnerable to not only the marauding fleets, but also in a case where the Republic manages to break through the Separatist line, the stationed defensive fleets fleeing their systems. So just to sort of summarize these points together, because the Separatists had a mobile offensive fleet, so to sort of summarize this, the CIS early on had a huge advantage. They were prepared for war, and by the time the Republic was able to marshal their own fleets An incursion into Separatist space would have required so many resources that it would have left other parts of the Republic vulnerable, and that was the space situation. The Republic was also suffering early on from not having enough clone troopers. Clones are often forced to the front lines, the most important battles, leaving other planets to fend for themselves without a proper militia sometimes, and ordinary soldiers struggled against the variety and numbers of CIS battle droids. Clone numbers in Star Wars Legends also just make no sense. At the beginning of the war, there were said to be less than 2 million clones. There are 2 million active and reserve soldiers in the US military alone. So the early blitzkrieg of the CIS allowed them to capture a lot of territory, while the scant Republic resources were being moved around only to the most important planets. After that, you had planets being lost through negotiation and attrition, and a loss of faith in the Republic, and that's where the early difficulties of the Clone Wars began, and why the war would end up becoming very convoluted and bloody.
The Battle of Salucami occurred in the second year of the Clone Wars, fairly early on. Prior to, General Grievous had been waging campaigns in the outer rim of the galaxy, with access to droid armies and several fleets. Prior to the battle, Grievous, in a recusant dreadnought, which I'll cover later, managed to capture Jedi Council Master Eth Koth. After the capture, Grievous sent a boasting message to the Jedi Council, promising to wipe out the Order and basically reaffirming his hate of the Jedi. However, within that message, as noted by Commander Wolf, was coordinates to the Salucami system, passed on through hand movements by Koth. In response, the Republic assembled a task force, boasting 3 Vendor-class Star Destroyers, including the Resolute, an Arquitens light cruiser, a shuttle, and 3 Consular Corvettes. The task force was headed by Jedi Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Adi Gala, as well as Admiral Wolf Yularen. The battle begins with the Republic fleet, minus the shuttle, jumping into Salucami, where Grievous was waiting with his recusant dreadnought and 3 munificent escorts. The recusant is actually a really interesting ship. The recusant comes in 2 variants, a smaller one and a larger one. The smaller recusant was very common during the Clone Wars. It was pretty cheap, it was highly automated, and overall, I wouldn't consider it to be super powerful. Tactically though, it does excel in certain situations. We see that it has a few very large cannons pointing directly forward, so in long-range engagements, or if it can keep enemy ships away, the recusant can sort of make up for its lesser durability. It also has lots of point defense cannons, and traditional broadside turbo lasers and flak guns. However, the model Grievous is using here is much larger, 2,500 versus 1,100 meters. Presumably the ship has a lot more firepower, and we see that, for example, the large forward-facing weapons are scaled up. We also see that Grievous's dreadnought is able to dominate a Venator in a broadside exchange. So this is a very unique vessel, and one the CIS did not field very often. As the Republic exited hyperspace, Grievous claimed to anticipate the engagement, as if he knew that Eth Koth would send out the message, but he was in no way prepared to begin an attack. He hadn't launched any fighters, for example. The fleet was not already in position. And this failure to use fighters will be one of the major issues throughout this battle. As the Republic Venators form a defensive line, the smaller vessels, including the Arquitens and the Consular cruisers, speed toward Grievous's fleet, somehow avoid turbo laser fire, and Obi-Wan goads the general into fighting him in individual combat. As this is happening, the Republic and CIS fleets begin to exchange long-range turbo laser attacks, but it seems like both fleets are really outside of effective range, and I would guess that only the recusant was doing significant damage here. Anakin and Adi Gala, who had been waiting in a nearby system in a shuttle, are sent hyperspace coordinates for Grievous's flagship. Obi-Wan allows Grievous to catch him in a tractor beam lock, and as a distraction is pulled in towards the ship. Concurrently, Anakin jumps in as close to Grievous's flagship as possible, completely unseen, attaches the shuttle, and begins an assault from the inside. Although ambushed by commando droids, the 2 Jedi do manage to rescue Koth, while Kenobi defeats Grievous in single combat, forcing him to retreat. Grievous, while trying to escape, does get punched in the face by Commander Cody, which is nice, but he orders the gunners on the recusant to destroy the attached Arquitens, and himself escapes in a CC-979 landing transport. The Jedi are picked up in Anakin's shuttle and move to pursue Grievous on the planet below. Grievous is tracked but eventually manages to escape, and Anakin leads the space battle, although unseen, and presumably manages to wipe out the rest of the Separatist task force, given the fact that the Recusant was completely abandoned. So this battle, as much as any in the Clone Wars, shows just how purely incompetent General Grievous could be at times. He did show some competency as a military commander, but he's also completely predictable and overall far too obsessed with killing Jedi in individual hand-to-hand combat. Let's start at the very beginning with the Eth Koth message. If Grievous knows that Eth Koth will be sending a message, that's a good strategy, but he's too arrogant to properly prepare for it, either with a larger task force or at least being tactically ready, i.e. fighters ready to go, and fleet in a proper formation. If he did have other plans for Eth Koth and he didn't use him as bait, then he was arrogant in a different way, sending a message and giving up his position. But those issues are pretty small compared to the actual battle itself. The CIS here is in a very advantageous position. The Jedi aren't going to want to destroy Grievous's flagship, which itself is a very, very destructive weapon. To be honest, those 4 Republic ships should not have been able to break through the CIS line like that. It's just not really consistent with the accuracy of turbo lasers and especially the lighter weapons of something like a laser cannon. I mean, we even see in episode 1 of the Clone Wars that a Munificent comes out of hyperspace and with a couple of shots manages to nail Yoda's Corvette. That being said, the second Grievous got a tractor beam lock on Obi-Wan's ship, he should have just destroyed it. That would have been Kenobi dead right there. Once that happens, I don't think the other small corvettes are that much of an issue. Just shoot at them whenever you can, and focus fire on the rest of the Republic fleet, which itself is in a very bad position. The Recusant can most likely body one of these Republic Star Destroyers straight up, especially with its forward-facing cannons, but I think there's an even better option. The Republic is going to have a really tough time launching fighters here. If they attempt to open their hangar doors, they'll expose themselves to major damage from the CIS capital ships. The Munificents and the Recusants, however, are able to launch fighters from unseen hangars. What I would do is keep the cruisers in place, hold them down with fire, then just launch my fighters at them. We've seen what Hyena bombers and other CIS starfighters can do against unprotected Republic capital ships. And another good thing is that the Recusant, I think, really shines at range. If the vendors come closer and focus fire on that ship, then they might be in trouble. However, because Eth Koth is a hostage, they're unlikely to do so. For those who are interested, I actually ran through a pure combat scenario in the new Empire at War mod, Fall of the Republic, which is a Clone Wars mod made by my friend Corey and the same team that made Thrawn's Revenge. Link to that in the description, by the way. And you can see that the CIS fleet at range is able to dominate the Venator line. The Corvettes get shredded very early on, but either way don't really have much impact on the larger battle. For the Jedi, their best strategy is to split their Star Destroyers, get on either broadside of the Recusant, and just pour fire in that way. With that, my scenario actually has the Republic able to win this battle. However, again, the major issue is that there's a hostage on the Recusant at that point. But because Grievous is so predictable, the Republic is able to make this whole strategy, knowing that he won't blow Obi-Wan out of the sky, even though he is more than capable of doing so. Then those Corvettes are able to get the information to transmit to Anakin, and well, things fall apart pretty quickly after this. I mean, Grievous always wants to fight Obi-Wan in direct combat, but he almost always loses, then is forced to run away. You know what would have been a good idea, my Grievous? Flip that around. Pretend to be in the Recusant, maybe have a droid impersonate you or sending a message on your behalf. Have the already highly automated ship and your crew of droids do exactly what you did up until the point where Anakin and Obi-Wan get on board, and then you know what? Just have the goddamn ship self-destruct. Blow all 4 Jedi up, collect their lightsabers in space, add them to your collection. That's a job well done and a good day's work. But that's just my opinion. The Battle of the Ark essentially ended the Human Covenant War. the Prophet of Truth and his brute fleet, having pierced the Earth's defensive array and uncovered the Great Portal, traveled to the Ark hoping to initiate the final stages of the Great Journey. Following Truth was a combined elite human fleet made up primarily of 1 Covenant assault carrier and 9 smaller cruisers. The fleet was coordinated by Shipmaster Artas Vadum. We know very little of the actual battle itself, mostly that despite being outnumbered 3-1, tactical superiority on the part of the elites allowed them to devastate the brute fleet. We know that, at minimum, the elite flagship, the Shadow of Intent, managed to survive the battle with no obvious damage. There's also a few lines from the Level the Ark which provide a bit of context, but really are just background noise. We know that Commander Keyes and the Forward Unto Dawn were part of the battle, at least to a limited extent. They fired their Mac cannon at several targets. Some of the longsword bombers went for runs on enemy capital ships. And then also on the elite side, that the fleet moved within the brute formation, such that the brutes were actually worried about hitting their own ships. It seemed to be a battle fought at extremely close range, and we even hear the shipmaster talk about ramming another ship. So, besides for those clues, which I'll try to contextualize later, let's briefly describe some of the key factors that went into the battle, and I'll start with a quick summary of Covenant battle tactics generally. I've actually covered Covenant battle strategy in prior videos, but I'll go over some of the quick specifics here. And to be honest, things are pretty basic. In general, due to the numerical and technological superiority of the Covenant during their war against humanity, the Covenant's general strategy was one of overwhelming force. As anyone who's really looked into Halo lore can confirm, the standard Covenant warship was sometimes dozens of times more powerful than its UNSC counterpart. Most strategy involved avoiding coordinated Mac barrages and preying on unshielded UNSC ships. However, general battle principles will be flipped on their head here, without 2 distinct elements of technology at play. Another key distinction, of course, is the 2 combatants. Instead of seeing Covenant versus humanity, we now have 2 very intellectually and behaviorally distinct Covenant sub-factions battling it out. So let's start from the most basic point of how the elites won the battle, and then go into nuance. Unsurprisingly, one of the largest factors is simply that elites were much better suited for this battle than the brutes. They were more experienced, had a better understanding of large capital ship technology and tactics, were able to coordinate better and use distinct formations, and just generally were better in space combat. Although brutes had achieved spacefaring status even before joining the Covenant, they, well, nuked themselves back to the Stone Age. The elites, on the other hand, managed to, well, not do that, which I think speaks positively to their at least behavioral capacity to fight in space in any sort of meaningful way. On a basic level, as I'm sure most of you understand, brutes are an incredibly aggressive and violent species, prone often to pure berserking rage. Elites too, especially when piloting starfighters, could also sometimes seek individual glory, paramount to anything else, however, not to the same degree as brutes. Let me elaborate. While elite society was based on status and hierarchy, brute society was even more so, and was less purely militaristic than elites. And if you're thinking, well, does that mean they're less violent? No, not really. More so that they functioned in less of a structured military society. Instead, brute society was pack-based, and as their species history shows, brutes were often incapable of large-scale cooperation. Elites as a whole, on the other hand, were incredibly intelligent and honorable, were very well suited for naval warfare, showing a capacity to not only work with other elites, but even other Covenant alien races. Framed in another way, brutes are such good warriors because of their ferocity and their incredible unmatched physiology. Of these 2 features, the latter will be no help in a space battle, while the former is a potential downside. But, as I said, you probably knew most of that, so let's look at how specifically the elites would have taken advantage of their better mentality and experience when facing off against the brutes. The biggest game changer in this battle, I think, besides for just general tactical know-how, is the way that elites will manage their capital ship shielding. There are 2 elements of shielding that are important here. First, as some background, Covenant shields were not only sturdy, but also fast recharging. Specific Covenant tactics were focused on multiple ships working together in tandem and utilizing complementary weapons. That's important because when a Covenant capital ship loses its shield, you need to be able to take advantage of that quickly. I think the elites will be more knowledgeable of this weakness and will be much better at coordinating multiple ships and different types of weapons. One common strategy would be to use something like energy projectors to do a lot of the damage against the shielding, or at least parts of the shield, while then coordinating second torpedo stripes before the defenses could be reset. Another meta aspect to this battle will be how each ship manages its weapons. Covenant capital ships actually have to open small parts of their shield to fire most weapons. This is something that I can see brutes being extremely careless about, especially if in any sort of aggressive or berserker rage, and something that the much more calculating elites will be able to take advantage of. Improperly managed shielding means that even a single CCS class cruiser could take down one of the larger carriers, because there's so much care involved in not overexposing your unshielded hull. It's more than that though, there's actually a lot of nuance to Covenant weaponry. For example, during Halo First Strike, in a quite memorable scene, we see Cortana explain that Covenant projectile technology is susceptible to magnetic interference, which can essentially cause not only ship-based guiding mechanisms to fail, but also a dissolution of the actual containment fields, essentially rendering the projectiles harmless. We know weapons like energy projectiles generate massive magnetic pulses, so perhaps something like that could be used by the more knowledgeable elites. We also see Cortana use the heat generated by a violent atmospheric entry to stop torpedoes from hitting their target. So there's a lot of options for somebody who understands the systems at play here. Interestingly, during that scenario as well, the onboard Covenant AI actually tried to scrub this information from the ship's system, leading me to believe that in the case of Covenant ship infighting, as was the case in Cortana's scenario, there are some opportunities for exploitation. The biggest issue for the brutes, I think, will be their inability to adapt to a different scenario. The Covenant tactic of overwhelming UNSC ships with numbers and much better technology will not really work here. Although the brutes do have numbers over the elites, the technology is equal. While elites will be much better capable of adapting to non-standard battle scenarios and different enemy tech. I also doubt that it's the real intelligent brutes even leading this fleet. The prophets at this point most likely would have been on the Ark, as would most of the high-ranking brutes, preparing for the Great Journey. So this is not a great scenario for the brutes who are remaining in space. But let's look at specifics. How would the elites have won? So the brutes attack with a staggered line, but as we see in the cutscene, the battle almost immediately devolves into a complete mess, with brute CAS cruisers doing, well, I don't really know. The elite ships will most likely minimize brute number advantages by moving to the middle of the formation, where only some of the brute ships will be able to use their weapons without the threat of hitting their allies. I think Shipmaster Vadum will take advantage of brute psychology and probably take out a few of the large capital ships first, whether through, as I mentioned, something like critical shots fired and temporarily downed shields, or taking advantage of careless brute weapon firing. The brutes who are commanding the remaining ships are probably not the brightest, and if trained, ready only to fight humans. This will be a problem for them. Regardless, I think step one is taking out the carriers through sheer overwhelming firepower. I see something like Wolfpack tactics working here, with the shipmaster spending enough firepower to take one shield down, then the smaller ships basically outputting the hull damage in the form of missiles and whatnot. After that, brute psychology actually helps out here. The transmissions from the level of the Ark reveal that the brutes are being too aggressive with their smaller ships, and the shipmaster has lines basically saying that the enemy was foolish to go to his broadside, that he's gutted them, and as I mentioned on one occasion, that he rams them. So sort of to summarize, I guess, besides for the psychological and behavioral aspects that I discussed earlier, I think the key tactic used by the shipmaster probably would have been to get within the brute lines so that fewer ships can be effective, thus neutralizing the numerical advantage, then using both brute carelessness and coordinated weapon fire to take down the big ships, then setting the much more powerful CAS carrier and the remaining fleet on the remaining CCS classes of the brutes. I really think the main issue here is that the Prophet just totally discounted the importance of protecting the Ark from space. I mean, he's down on the construct within his Dreadnought and basically sends a message out, but I don't think he was really concerned. Another aspect is that the UNSC forces and the Pelican dropships did seem to pull some of the fighters with them, and the remaining longswords, as well as the frigate itself while it remained in battle, probably did provide a little bit of extra help.
The Republic's invasion and capture of Geonosis kicked off the Clone Wars. However, as fighting spread across the galaxy and the Republic was spread thin, a Separatist force made its way back to the planet. The Geonosian droid factories were restarted by Polgo the Lesser and protected by powerful ray shields, preventing orbital bombardment. In response, the Republic assembled a large task force led by Admiral Yularen and the flagship Resolute to strike at the planet and remove the Separatist factories. After achieving space superiority, the Republic developed the following plan. They would launch 3 forces, each led by a Jedi General, which would converge at a single location outside of the energy shield, known as Point Rain. Point Rain would then serve as a staging ground for the ultimate attack on the shield generator. However, because of strong droid defenses, actually securing the landing zone would be extremely difficult. That's why the Republic used 3 task forces as an attempt to split the Separatist defenses, while then later converging on a single point. The first step, of course, was to actually land troops on the planet. The Republic fleet takes position outside of the landing zone, and dropships as well as Y-Wings are unloaded. Here we see a serious tactical error by the Republic fleet, and one that would color the entire course of the battle. Defensively, the Geonosians have deployed heavy flak and anti-air cannons, which pick apart the relatively slow and fragile gunships, as do Geonosian fighters. Several squads of Y-Wings had attempted to soften up the defenses, but they weren't given enough time. What would have been a better strategy? Well, there are 2 options depending on how big you want to go. First off, dedicate more bombers to actually weakening the defenses and give them more time to work. However, I think an even better option would be to make use of the big guns on your capital ships. The Republic has space superiority over the planet, and at least some of the flak and AA cannons were outside of the shield. Honestly, just park a cruiser somewhere and flatten everything outside of the ray shields. I mean, obviously the Geonosians could fire at the cruiser itself, but if you park it in orbit, for example, I don't see any way they could effectively attack a capital ship. Perhaps there were some ground-based weapons or something preventing a cruiser attack, but still, throwing your transport straight into enemy anti-aircraft emplacements is just unacceptable. The transports also should have been given a starfighter escort. We do see some Y-Wings with them, but ideally a squadron or 2 of ARC 170s could have escorted the very valuable but vulnerable transports to the ground. Anyway, onto what actually happened. As the Republic runs into a wall of flak, Skywalker's dropship is disabled and his force proceeds on foot. And this is the case for the vast majority of the invading troops. However, enough dropships do get through that the Republic is able to establish an ATTE vanguard, but only Kenobi's force actually reaches the landing zone. The Jedi General himself was shot down about 5 kilometers east of Point Rain, but is rescued by Waxer and Boyle. Ki-Adi-Mundi's force is also unable to rendezvous at Point Rain and is separated from both Kenobi and Skywalker. The CIS counterattacks, both attempting to surround the ATTEs and cut off Republic reinforcements. While this is happening, CIS starfighters are attacking the Republic fleet, meaning air support is unavailable, and now we have a serious missed opportunity for the Separatists. The Republic Vanguard is barely holding back a ground assault. They have almost no way of taking out enemy starfighters, and a Hyena bomber, or even just a pair of Geonosian starfighters, likely could have inflicted mass casualties, and even broken the attack outright. Instead, the Republic is able to hold out as Skywalker leads his troops through a CIS fortress and Mundi through a Geonosian-filled cave system. The 2 Jedi rendezvous and with their combined forces are able to fight their way to Point Rain. The Republic fleet is able to spare a single squadron of Y-Wings, which clear out the Separatist forces who have dedicated themselves to trying to break the Republic's defensive position. And this really illustrates the importance of air support, which I've been harping on this entire time. With the Republic forces now weakened but unified, they move to step 2 of the plan, Anakin and a squad of clones move through the shield and disable Geonosis sensor systems. With a window of opportunity, Republic armor moves in and destroys the shield generator as well as CIS weapon emplacements. With the major Separatist stronghold before the droid foundry now destroyed and a secure landing zone, the Republic is able to land a second wave of ground forces, led by General Unduli. Next, the Republic destroys the Separatist super tank factory. Unduli and Skywalker feint a direct attack, while Ahsoka and Barriss infiltrate the factory through underground tunnels and destroy it with one of their own tanks. With resistance broken and the major objective accomplished, the Republic begins mop-up maneuvers, destroying secondary factories and capturing Poggle the Lesser. However, all of this was accomplished only through serious losses, and we see again that the Republic mismanaged their space superiority. Geonosis was already a dust ball, and one inhabited by creatures who the Republic had no problem exterminating. To be frank, they should have bombed the ever-living crap out of the planet, or at least the landing zone, which would have saved many Republic lives. And to be honest, I think a much better plan would have involved the landing of a covert Jedi squad, perhaps Anakin, Obi-Wan, Ahsoka, and whoever else can be spared, having them stealthily disable the generator, then just bomb the planet from orbit. But I mean, it doesn't have to be so violent. If you remove the shield generator, they've really got no way to survive such an attack or to strike back, so you could probably even force a surrender. In 22 ABY, 7 weeks after the Battle of Geonosis, the Confederacy of Independent Systems targeted the resource-rich planet of CHRISTOPHSIS. A Separatist fleet moved in, landing an invasion force and blockading the planet. Although local resistance was somewhat effective at holding back the Separatist ground assault, they were not only quickly being overrun, but also running out of food and resources. Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker is tasked with breaking the blockade, which is led by Admiral Trench in his flagship, the Invincible. The Republic, who had received poor information about the size of the Separatist fleet, arrived with only 3 Venator cruisers and a trio of Pelta frigates carrying supplies. Trench's blockade, however, is comprised of over 30 ships, including his Providence Dreadnought, several Lucrehulk battleships, and of course munificent frigates. The Republic's beginning assault is totally ineffective. Initially, Anakin attempts to charge through the blockade, but Obi-Wan jumps into system with his Star Destroyer, the Negotiator, and convinces the Jedi to regroup. And to be honest, that's probably for the best. They weren't anywhere close to being through the blockade, and they had already received serious damage. Luckily for the Republic, Trench orders the flotilla to maintain position, allowing the 7 ships to escape. Obi-Wan reveals to Anakin that he has brought with him a new, state-of-the-art stealth ship. However, it is not to be used to fight the blockade itself. Anakin is sent on a relief mission to the planet, joined by Admiral Yularen, who has identified the presumed dead Admiral Trench as the leader of the blockade. As Anakin pushes towards the planet, Trench makes a move intended to pull the hidden Republic fleet out of hiding. He sends a squadron of hyena bombers to the planet's surface, which bomb the Resistance's position. As a note, before I explain what happens next, you should understand, when using a stealth ship, you cannot both use the stealth capabilities and fire your weapons at once. Anakin decloaks, firing torpedoes at the Invincible. Unfortunately, Trench has high-powered thermal shields which protect the bridge from the assault. Anakin is barely able to recloak and avoid a barrage of incoming turbo lasers. In consultation with Obi-Wan, Skywalker realizes that Trench has some ability to track cloaked ships through their magnetic signatures. In the past, he's taken advantage of this through tracking torpedoes. Anakin fires a second set of torpedoes, forcing Trench to activate his shields and giving away his position. Once his ship has a lock on the stealth ship, Trench fires the tracking torpedoes. With a magnificent bit of flying, Anakin is able to outrun the torpedoes and run them straight into Trench's cruiser. They impact onto the bridge, disabling the Providence and seriously injuring Trench, who nonetheless somehow survives. This is one of Trench's 2 major mistakes. He was only vulnerable to attack here because he lowered his shields to fire the missiles at Anakin's stealth ship, and by the time he realized what was happening, it was too late for him to move and his shields were not recharged. His second major mistake was his misuse of his support fleet. He should have stayed within the blockade. That way there could have been dozens of ships firing at the stealth ship instead of just one. Also, he should have been more aggressive during the initial Republic attack. Yes, the Lucrehulks and the other large ships should have remained in position, but he had the Jedi on the ropes. He should have followed them with some of his munificent frigates. With the flagship down, Obi-Wan moves the fleet in towards the blockade.
To be honest, I don't know how he's able to break through the still near 30 ships. I think most likely the fleet chooses a weak point and pierces the blockade there. Of course, not all Separatist ships are destroyed. The real purpose here was to land supplies on the planet's surface. The Jedi, several clone trooper groups, and heavy vehicles are able to reinforce the planet's surface, pushing back the Separatists until a secondary, larger fleet appears, mopping up any space forces and further reinforcing the ground. The Battle of Geonosis kicked off the Clone Wars, with the Republic making a full-scale effort to rescue Padme, Anakin, and Obi-Wan, while also trying to eliminate the droid foundries of Geonosis. In order to critique their attack plan, we have to understand what they actually did, with reference to Star Wars Legends works. As we see in the Clone Wars video game, the Republic fleet, comprised of both starfighters and cruisers, approached the planet, which at the time, at least space-wise, was relatively undefended. The planet's primary defense was actually ground-based anti-orbital cannons, which a strike team of Jedi quickly dispatched, allowing the Republic transports to unload their full forces on the planet. Also facilitating the landing was a group of Jedi who removed nearby forces and cleared out a zone. As this was happening, a large portion of the Jedi headed towards the Geonosian arena as others stayed back to begin coordinating the Republic ground assaults. The assault forces were targeting both the droid factories and Geonosian core ships. Taking both out was necessary. The factories would produce more troops, while the Geonosian core ships each held over 1 million droids. At the arena, the Jedi are overwhelmed by droid forces, but thankfully rescued by the Republic. They're then moved to the front lines to spearhead the Republic assaults and operate as commanders. A key aspect of the Republic strategy was the grounding of Separatist troops. Most of the Navy was on the planet's surface, picking up droids for future battles, and Separatist starfighters were also quickly destroyed, giving the Republic air superiority. This allows LAT gunships to dominate the sky, and eventually the Republic pushes the droids back on the ground. The specifics aren't super important here, and there's not one battle or one skirmish that can be said to have turned the tide. However, the Republic was overwhelmingly deploying troops, pushing the Separatists back, causing the leadership to order a retreat. This retreat was ultimately fairly successful. Almost all of the CIS leadership made it off planet, and the Republic even struggled to bring down the almost defenseless Trade Federation core ships. This is what I meant at the beginning. Although they did successfully rescue the Jedi and capture the planet, they had the chance to seriously stunt the Separatist war effort and remove the faction's leadership, including Count Dooku, and failed. So let's analyze Republic strategy. They emphasized ground combat, landing military troops, and assaulting Separatist assets conventionally. Does that make sense though? Well, sort of. Troops obviously had to be landed to rescue the Jedi. However, in my mind, fighting the droids on the ground was a pretty big mistake. Let's look at the facts. First of all, Geonosis had no shield, something extraordinarily rare for a planet of its importance. This is basically a tactical gift for the Republic, and I think any smart military commander would have taken advantage of this. You might be wondering how I know there was no planetary shield. Well, the Republic traveled to and from the planet's surface without any difficulty. A planetary shield would have prevented that. What's more, it would have been so important to the actual battle itself that we would have heard of it. Many of the core ships have their own shields, or the Separatist bases themselves, but not the planet. There was also no planetary defense fleet, and after destroying the ground-based cannons, the Republic cruisers really have no opposition. We do see some Lucrehulks present at the end of the battle when the leadership is retreating, but I'm not confident that they were there the whole time, and even if they were, I think the Acclimators could have stood up against them. Part of the problem is that Acclimators, the Republic's main ship at this point, were transport cruiser hybrids. So, in order to land troops on the planet's surface, the fleet had to actually leave its position in orbit. So, by focusing on the ground, you give up a huge advantage. Here's what I would have done instead. I would have, of course, sent the Jedi in to help on the planet's surface. They're useless in space anyway. But I would have only sent in a much smaller ground force, enough to basically support the Jedi and do little else. I wouldn't have landed troops with my capital ships, using instead smaller transports. The fleet would have remained in orbit, blockading the planet, which is important, and bombing everything in sight. The Attack of the Clones cross-section book tells us specifically that a group of Acclimators are capable of performing a base Delta Zero orbital assault. The ground troops would have been responsible only for securing the Jedi, retreating
landing successfully and perhaps identifying a few key targets. And again, I just spread the acclimators out and rain destruction from orbit. This accomplishes the Republic's major objectives. The Jedi can still be rescued, the grounded Separatist navy is destroyed before it can launch, and in fact more of it is destroyed and quicker, because instead of having to land troops and fight through resistance, my navy is totally unopposed. I can also destroy Separatist assets like factories, and if I don't kill the leadership during the bombing, the fleet should, at the very least, be able to catch them when they try to escape. Make the enemy fight you on your terms. Don't play to their advantage. The Republic had basically total control of space. Landing troops and fighting against billions of battle droids just doesn't make sense to me. I think this strategy can probably be tied to a few different things. One, the Jedi had almost no experience formally leading a military, and in reality were poorly suited for the role. Second, my method is extraordinarily brutal and basically removes the prospect of peace. Finally, Palpatine needed the Death Star plans to get off planet and needed the Separatists to be a viable fighting force so he could militarize the Republic in the face of the Clone Wars. The Reapers were an incredibly advanced race of starship-shaped synthetic beings. Their singular purpose was cleansing the Milky Way galaxy of life and further adding to their greater overall intelligence, something they did every 50,000 years. In Mass Effect 1, we're introduced to the Reaper Sovereign. In 2183, Sovereign with an accompanying Geth fleet attacked the Citadel. The Citadel was a gigantic megastructure of Reaper creation, which basically served as the meeting place of galactic races and the center of civilization. However, more nefariously, it was also a gigantic mass relay station connected to dark space. Sovereign's goal was to activate the relay, allowing the rest of the Reaper fleet to move in and purge the galaxy. Defending the Citadel was a defense fleet comprised of vessels from several alien races, but primarily Turian ships. The fleet's flagship was the Destiny Ascension, an Asari dreadnought and an absolutely gigantic vessel. However, even with the dreadnought, the fleet was underpowered, with Citadel races spreading most of their forces throughout the galaxy. As Sovereign and the Geth fleet exited their mass relay and headed towards the Citadel fleet moved into a screening position. Knowing that the Citadel could easily come under attack, the Destiny Ascension also moved in to evacuate the important Alliance Council members. The fleet also orders the Citadel itself close. Sovereign allows this, moving the Reaper within the ship's protective shell, and once inside, Reaper Agent Saren is able to disable the Citadel and the nearby mass relay. This basically prevents the retreat of any engaged forces, while also making sure that no reinforcements would show up. The Geth fleet, which remained outside the Citadel, has mostly focused on the Destiny Ascension at this point, and the ship is suffering heavy damage. And this is where Mass Effect's branching storyline comes into play. I'll talk about what I think is the most realistic option, then at the end I'll also mention the alternative. So from within the station, Commander Shepard is able to kill Saren and retake control of the Citadel and the nearby mass relay. Shepard receives a message from Alliance forces in a nearby system who offer to jump through the mass relay and reinforce the Council fleet. They do so and strike unexpectedly at the Geth, taking them by surprise and saving the Destiny Ascension, albeit with the heavy loss of human life. With the Geth fleet more or less defeated, Shepard also opens the Citadel and the entire defense force moves in and attacks Sovereign. Although the Reaper is able to take an absolute beating, he is eventually defeated. The Reaper invasion is delayed, but ultimately not stopped. However, the attack on the Citadel causes the Council to at least acknowledge the threat, and humanity is given a full seat among the other alien races. The other branching option, which I actually took the first time I played the game because I hated the Council, was to allow the Destiny Ascension to be destroyed. The human fleet is only called in after the Dreadnought is defeated, and it focuses on Sovereign only with less human lives lost. The Council being dead, however, doesn't really carry over to later games. There's an option to form an all-human council, but that never really manifests. After heavy fighting both on planet and in atmosphere, the Confederacy of Independent Systems has successfully blockaded the planet Ryloth, starving out the planet's citizens and dominating remaining forces on the ground. After successfully defeating a Republic strike group, the CIS has sole control over the space around the planet. Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker, supported by Republic Admiral Yularen and Ahsoka Tano, is tasked with breaking the blockade. Initially, this blockade consists of one Lucrehulk command ship and 2 munificent frigates. The Republic responds with a fairly light force of only 3 Venator-class cruisers and no support ships. Upon exiting hyperspace, the Republic launches a squadron of V-19 fighters, which are countered by the more numerous droid starfighters of the CIS. Still, losses are very light on the Republic side, and the initial plan is to have Ahsoka and the clones both clear out enemy starfighters and soften up the capital ships so the Republic cruisers can attack the blockade without major damage. While this is happening, the cruisers themselves are remaining outside of firing distance. As Ahsoka's starfighter squadron appears to break the Confederate lines, 4 more munificent frigates appear, reinforcing the blockade and launching more starfighters, which now not only overwhelm the V-19s, but also make bombing runs against the unprotected Republic cruisers. The 3 Venators are seriously damaged, 1 is lost, and Anakin's command ship, the Resolute, is nearly crippled after a droid starfighter hits its bridge. The Republic retreats, having lost a Star Destroyer and most of their fighters, while the CIS takes very little losses. Instead of giving chase, however, the Confederacy chooses to maintain the blockade and not push the attack. Now retreated, the Republic moves all personnel and starfighters to the Resolute, with Skywalker taking personal control over the damaged Defender, the second Venator. He quickly jumps back to Ryloth and offers his surrender to the CIS. As the second Republic ship re-enters the battle, Anakin jettisons from the Defender and sets it to crash with the Lucrehulk command ship. The tactic is successful, and the Separatists are now left with not only 1 less capital ship, but also significantly less droid starfighters and a lack of centralized command. Now singular battle droids are the highest ranking officers on the 6 remaining munificents. The second ship, which is outgunned by 6 well-armed munificent frigates, utilizes the Marg Sable technique, rotating and using its heavily armored ventral side to soak up fire, while bombers are launched from the dorsal hangar bay. The munificent frigates, totally without fighter support, are absolutely eviscerated by Republic heavy Y-wings. The Separatist fleet is, for all intents and purposes, destroyed, Anakin is recovered, and the blockade is broken. Soon, Jedi-led reinforcements in Acclamator-class assault ships arrive, a great win for the forces and citizens of Ryloth. So, what went wrong here for the Confederacy? I think their first major mistake was not heavily pursuing Anakin's forces. We directly hear that the CIS knew that Anakin would return. By the end of the first attack on Ryloth, the Republic fleet is literally on the ropes. The Confederacy has absolute air superiority with their starfighters, and they heavily outgun even 3 healthy Venator cruisers. 2 heavily damaged warships would have been absolutely no problem. They basically give the Republic a chance to catch their breath while holding the blockade, which at this point has absolutely no purpose. What's more, Anakin Skywalker's flagship, the Resolute, is identified. So a loss here would have not only harmed the Republic war effort, but also killed one of their greatest heroes. Preventing retreat, I think, would have been fairly easy. The capital ships had no more shields. All the starfighters had to do was either target the engines or the prominent bridges, but instead they just back off and give the Republic time to retreat. What about the mistakes of the Republic, however? Well, this one is pretty obvious, and it has to do with the first attack. The Republic horribly managed their starfighters, sending out only 1 squadron of V-19s. First off, they knew they were facing a droid control ship, so they should have expected a high starfighter complement. We also see later on that they actually had many more starfighters on board. Why not send 1 group to attack the fleet and leave a second group to screen against starfighters and protect the Venators? What's more, I get using V-19s in the initial attack. They're so fast and the Republic kind of wanted to just punch through, but why not go for Y-wings instead? They pack a lot more punch and they're very sturdy. Today we'll be examining the Battle of Coruscant, and I want to get right into it, but before we do, just a couple of things. First of all, I've changed how I color ships in this video. I used to just use black for all of them. Let me know if you think this looks better and if it's easier to see. Second, there's no way I can really illustrate the scale of the Battle of Coruscant without some sort of supercomputer. So when you see one ship here, imagine several hundred. Finally, as I did for my video on the Battle of Earth, this is less a look at the actual minute tactics of the Battle of Coruscant because it was a prolonged campaign, but rather a chronology of important events and an examination of strategy. So let's get started.
The CIS planned their attack during a major Republic event where much of the government's political elite would be on planet. This obviously left Coruscant as a major target, but there was no serious worry. For one, the planet was always a target during the Clone Wars, and the massive Coruscant home fleet was stationed in orbit, ready to protect the Republic's capital. Coruscant was also deep in the galactic core, and it was believed that if any Separatists moved towards the planet because of the presence of Republic stations among major hyperspace lanes, they would be identified. However, in a very Palpatinian move, the Confederacy struck using a previously unknown hyperroute. They collected much of their fleet in the deep core and launched a surprise attack on the Republic. Before we go into the actual attack, let's take a second to look at the home defense fleet. I've analyzed fleet composition during the Battle of Coruscant in prior videos, mostly in reference to various works like the Republic Commando series. If you're interested in how I get the numbers I use today, I'll link to that video above. Anyway, although depleted due to the need for ships in the Outer Rim, the home defense fleet would have still included thousands of vessels, primarily Venators, Carracks, and Dreadnoughts. Striking with surprise, a massive Separatist fleet made up largely of munificent frigates, recusant destroyers, but also with some Providence Dreadnoughts and Lucrehulk battleships, was able to catch the Republic fleet unprepared, destroying a large portion of the defense force before they could activate their shields or weapons. As the fighting continued in space, the Separatists launched a raid against the planet proper, moving their fleet under the not yet activated planetary shield, while the surviving Republic ships attempted to form a defensive screen in order to prevent more Separatist forces from reaching the planet's surface. The CIS began targeting orbital assets, well, also where the Republic reinforcements were almost certainly on their way, planted interdictor mines in an effort to slow down responding ships. Scramblers were also used to mess up communication, although the Republic would eventually bypass these technologies. At this point, it's important to mention that the Separatist Navy was being led by General Grievous, who, unlike Dooku, was not aware of Sidious's motivations or that the CIS was ultimately designed to lose the war. So he, along with basically everyone other than Palpatine, was probably surprised when the first wave of Republic reinforcements arrived. As we learn in the Order 66 novel, the ships here were brand new, some never before seen. I'd imagine that this is where some of the first Imperial ships, including the Imperator, Tector, and Victory 2 Star Destroyers, made their official debut. On the surface, Grievous was successful in capturing Palpatine and escaped to space. However, the fighting was very heavy at this point, and the CIS were no longer dominating. Fleeing to his command ship, Grievous was pursued by several Jedi. However, a large group of buzz droids launched from a nearby Lucrehulk was able to stop the pursuers. Safely at the Invisible Hand, Grievous broadcasted Palpatine's capture to the Republic, causing massive demoralization across the galaxy. However, any sense of a Separatist victory would be short-lived. Almost immediately after, the tide of battle was turned as the various open circle fleets arrived before Grievous was able to flee. With this, the Coruscanti planetary shields were activated, preventing a Separatist retreat. The CIS were now on the defensive and moved to protect Grievous's flagship, the Invisible Hand. With the open circle fleet came famed Jedi Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. With the help of the 501st, the two heroes moved towards Grievous's cruiser, evading droid fighters on their way. As they boarded, the Garlara, a Venator Star Destroyer, believing that Palpatine was already rescued and off ship, broke through the CIS screen and engaged the Invisible Hand at point-blank range, seriously damaging the flagship. On board, the Jedi defeated Dooku, who is killed, and Grievous, who retreats. However, Home Fleet Strike Group 5, led by none other than future Imperial Lorth Nida, launches another attack on the Invisible Hand, damaging it and causing it to fall to the planet's surface. With Palpatine rescued and the Invisible Hand destroyed, the Confederacy have failed all of their primary mission objectives. They collect Grievous, the planetary shield is either destroyed or lowered, and the fleet escapes through hyperspace. This spells the beginning of the end for the Confederacy of Independent Systems. They gambled with a lightning attack on Coruscant and lost. However, if we're being honest, the Confederacy really had no chance here. They were designed to fail. The Battle of Coruscant was supposed to scare the citizens of the galaxy and move the Republic towards further militarization. Palpatine's second goal was to move Anakin further towards the dark side and prepare the young Jedi to replace Dooku as his apprentice. I'd say he was pretty successful in that respect. The Confederacy's major mistake, and you can hardly call it a mistake because there's no way they could have prepared for this, was underestimating how long it would take the Republic Navy to respond to the attack. Obviously, Palpatine's secret fleet slowed down CIS progress, then with the open circle fleets, the numbers were just overwhelming. After the destruction of Alpha Halo, a rare human victory, the UNSC would learn of a plot to conquer Earth itself. An estimated 500 ships, under the command of the Prophet of Truth, were gathered in the Tau Ceti system. This was one of the largest Covenant forces ever seen, and was secretly massed only 11.9 light years away from Earth. At the heart of the fleet was the massive unyielding Hierophant, which served as a command and control station. It resembled two joined teardrops, with a wheel at the center joined by spokes. The massive 10-kilometer vessel was not only responsible for commanding the fleet, but also performing repairs and maintenance. It was fairly clear to Master Chief that if this fleet ever reached Earth, the planet would be easily overwhelmed. Now, just as a note, the battle groups that attack Earth in October of the same year during the events of Halo 2 and Halo 3 are actually separate than what we're talking about here. Those were under the command of Regret.
And we most definitely regret the Corps just blew up our raggedy-ass fleet! Hoorah!
While this fleet is under the command of Truth, who kept it a secret. The UNSC devised a plan to take out the station and hopefully the massive fleet as well. This would be known as Operation First Strike. Now, as a bit of background, Master Chief and the other survivors of Alpha Halo had managed to steal a Covenant DDS-class cruiser, the Ascendant Justice. Knowing the location of the Covenant Armada, a Spirit dropship was reinforced and jumped through slip space. Aboard it were Spartans John 117, Fred 104, Will 043, Grace 093, and Linda 058, as well as Cortana. Once the ship arrived, it put out a request for assistance to the Covenant, who hauled the dropship to a repair bay aboard the unyielding Hierophant. Meanwhile, the Ascendant Justice exited slipspace near the Oort cloud within the system. The Spartans on board the station encountered no resistance, only running into Huragox, which ignored them, and Ungoi, which are easy to avoid. Chief uploads Cortana into the station's computers, and the AI is able to not only download a copy of the station map, but also provides assistance, unlocking doors and watching the Spartans move stealthily for hours through kilometers of piping and conduits. Soon they reached one of the Hierophant's reactors, which was more heavily guarded than the rest of the ship. As Linda, as she often did, provided covering fire with her sniper rifle, the rest of the team made a 300-meter sprint to the main reactor, engaging grunts, brutes, and elites. Unfortunately, Grace is killed, but the rest of Blue Team survives. After entering the reactor room itself, Cortana is able to set them to explode, and Blue Team attempts to make their way out of the station. However, they were facing many more Covenant reinforcements. With Cortana having broken herself up into multiple pieces and attempting to disrupt station-wide communication, Blue Team drops mines and steals Banshees as Master Chief doubles back in a craft to pick up Linda. By the way, Linda had been dangling upside down from a rope, sniping out Banshee pilots with her rifle in one hand while holding onto the rope with her other. Pretty badass. Blue Team, now unified, although of course without Grace, managed to steal a second dropship, which they used to escape. Back in system, the Ascendant Justice, still commanded by Vice Admiral Whitcomb, detached from the UNSC Gettysburg, which had been picked up at Reach. Whitcomb, as well as Oni Lieutenant Haverson, got the attention of the Covenant by falsely stating that they possessed a Forerunner crystal. They had actually discovered one on Reach, but that was on the Gettysburg. The Covenant, not wanting to fire on and thus destroy a Forerunner artifact, nonetheless moved their fleet around the ship. It was at that time that the unyielding Hierophant's reactors finally blew, destroying not only the station, but the vast majority of the 500 capital ships massed nearby. All but 12 ships are annihilated by the reactor overload, which, by the way, is the most classic Halo way to possibly die, and the surviving UNSC soldiers are able to return to Earth. Despite the death of Grace, Operation First Strike was one of the most successful battles for the UNSC during the Human-Covenant War. However, for the Covenant, even though Earth's impending attack was delayed, the loss of the station and the massive fleet was seen as no more than an insignificant setback. The Prophet of Regret would assault Earth the following month, and Truth would reinforce his forces shortly after. thereafter. Still, given that the UNSC lost only a Spartan, a captured Covenant ship, while the alien bastards lost nearly 500 ships and the unyielding Hierophant, it's hard not to get excited about this kind of victory. But that also tells us the size of the Covenant Empire. 500 ships, while still a loss, is not enough to ruin the war effort. If humanity lost 500 ships at any point in the war, they would have been completely done. Now, obviously, Knights of the Old Republic is an RPG with a branching storyline. However, the light side ending is the one that's canon, so that's what we'll be using when talking about today's video. It all started when the Republic fleet was sent the position of the Starforge by the crew of the Ebon Hawk, and they immediately massed a fleet comprised primarily of Hammerhead cruisers and 4A corvettes, but supported by Chela and Aurak starfighters. The Ebon Hawk itself was actually first on the scene, but was disabled by a ground-based disruptor field on the nearby planet Lehon. Thankfully, the weapon was turned off by Revan before the Republic fleet exited hyperspace. Protecting this station was a fleet of Sith ships, thousands of them, with new ships continually rolling off the Starforge's assembly line. On the station itself, fallen Jedi Bastila Shan began using her renowned powers of battle meditation, empowering and coordinating the Sith fleet while also demoralizing the Republic. A strike team of Revan in the now repaired Ebon Hawk and other Jedi from the Republic fleet were dispatched to lead a strike on the Starforge, hoping to incapacitate or kill Bastila. Every second counted because as the Jedi worked through the station, the Republic was getting battered in space. The Sith maintained a strong defensive line, protecting the Starforge, while the Republic was forced to the outskirts of the system. They would continually prod different ship formations, looking for a crack in the defensive line, but nothing gave. The tide of battle was turned as Revan defeated Bastila in combat and returned her to the light side of the Force. Bastila restarted her battle meditation, now supporting the Republic. The loss of cohesion among Sith forces and the swing of momentum manifested in the sought-after crack in the defensive line. Republic Red and Green starfighter wings were first through the breach and targeted fighters and capital ships, clearing the way for Republic cruisers. As more and more ships broke the line, the Sith were left flat-footed, and only the starfighters were able to respond with any sort of speed. By now, however, much of the Republic fleet was over the Starforge itself and attacking from extremely close range. Sith starfighters did cause some resistance, but the Republic, now totally coordinated, had their own starfighters protecting their large ships. With hundreds if not thousands of individual turbolaser batteries now focused on the Starforge, it wasn't long before the station was critically disabled. As the Republic pulled their fleet back, the Starforge began to collapse and crashed into Lehon's star, which it had been using for power. There are 3 or 4 people who deserve credit for the Republic victory. First is Jedi Master Vandar, who sent forces to aid Revan in his strike against the Starforge. Next up we have Revan and Bastila. Revan of course saved Bastila from the dark side of the Force, while she used her battle meditation to directly swing the tide of battle. However, also very deserving of credit is Admiral Thorn Dodonna. First and foremost, Dodonna oversaw the survival of the Republic fleet as the Sith battle meditation was empowering their navy. Without that survival against overwhelming odds and continually replenishing Sith ships, there would have been no forces capable of attacking the Starforge itself. However, she also very effectively took advantage of the cracks in the Sith formation and immediately saw the need to dedicate a large portion of her forces. Of course, the battle meditation did help with that, however, without a strong military leader, the Republic would not have won this battle. What about the Sith? Well, their only real mistakes were probably caused by the effects of battle meditation. The real mistake was by Malak, who, although realizing that Bastila must be susceptible to turning to the light side, didn't fully protect her. He should have stayed in the same room with her at all times because the two of them combined probably could have defeated Revan.
About 3 to 4 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Phoenix Cell we've been following throughout Rebels is still trying to establish itself. One of my favorite parts of Rebels is that the show takes a lot of time showing how hard the Rebels fight for their ships. Their fleet, for example, has 3 Hammerhead cruisers which they covertly acquired from the Alderaanians. However, one major problem right now is that the fleet doesn't have a true flagship. Their previous vessel, Phoenix Home, was destroyed in a battle with Vader, and they're not able to easily dock, resupply, and take care of their starfighters. And at the beginning of Season 2, Episode 15, we see that this results in the loss of an A-Wing. However, an interesting situation presents itself. Orbiting the planet Ryloth is a Quasar-class cruiser. I actually love the Quasar, and I have since the Truth at Bakura. It's one of the most functional carriers ever, essentially a flying hangar. It's perfect for Phoenix Squadron, which essentially needs a mobile base of operations. Also, if they can capture this Quasar, it will make things much easier for Ryloth resistance fighters on the planet's surface. The Quasar, as it stands, is serving as the mothership for TIE bombers, which are frequently making runs at the planet's surface. Alongside the Quasar-class cruiser is an Imperial command ship, and on board the Quasar, as mentioned, is a set of TIE bombers, which, however, are leaving the ship at fairly regular patterns. So here's the plan. Hera reconnects with her father, Cham Syndulla, and they create a plan which will see them board the Quasar. There's one problem, however. The Ryloth freedom fighters want to destroy the ship, which is obviously a symbol of Imperial oppression, while the rebels want to steal it and add it to their fleet. Ultimately, Syndulla agrees to go along with Phoenix Squadron, however, he brings explosives along and plans to double-cross them. The way the rebels enter the ship is very interesting. Cham has managed to secure a TIE bomber, and we see a technique very similar to what's used at the beginning of the Mandalorian Season 2 finale. When the onboard bombers head down to the surface for bombing runs, the TIE bomber pretends to be chased by A-Wings and boards the Imperial ship. Unknown to the Phoenix Squad members, this is also laden with explosives, and upon landing, the Ryloth freedom fighters stun the Phoenix Squad and disable the ship's hyperdrive. I do briefly want to note that this reminds me of the destruction of the Night Hammer from Star Wars Legends. In that story, Callista Ming pilots a TIE bomber into the hangar of the Superstar Destroyer Night Hammer and basically uses the munitions of the TIE and other parked TIEs to cause a catastrophic fatal injury to the Dreadnought. Anyway, the rebels manage to free themselves. They make their way to the carrier's bridge, as Cham and his team are doing their own thing, neutralizing the ship's hyperdrive and planting explosives. Eventually, Ezra uses a coercive mind trick to force the captain to call an abandoned ship, and essentially the rebels have the vessel to themselves. There's only one problem. The explosives have already been placed. Cham Syndulla is unwilling to cooperate, so essentially the rebels are now a sitting duck. It doesn't take long for the other Imperial ship, the light cruiser, to realize that something is wrong, and in response it prepares a boarding shuttle filled with heavily armed stormtroopers. On the bridge of the cruiser carrier, Hera and her father have a heart-to-heart. They talk about whether they should be fighting for just their planet or as part of something greater, with Hera obviously taking the latter position, and in the end, the Ryloth hardliners decide that stealing the ship is the better option, especially given that it can be used to continue the fight against the Empire. Anyway, as the shuttle is launched, the TIE bombers are also returning from their attack on the planet's surface. The rebels now, as one cohesive group, man the point defense cannons on the cruiser carrier and are somewhat successful at warding off the attack, but the TIE bombers get a clean bombing run across the surface of the ship, causing serious damage. Thankfully, the boarding shuttle as well is able to be repelled, and the rebels come up with a plan to target the command ship. Essentially, they take all of the explosives which were meant for the carrier, they load it into one of the remaining TIE bombers, and Ezra, through the Force, throws it essentially at the enemy. The captain of the Imperial cruiser doesn't realize the vessel's true threat. He allows it to get close, and the TIE bomber explodes, catching one of the forward magazines of the cruiser in the blast, causing a critical and fatal blow to the Imperial ship. The carrier is able to escape and becomes the new flagship for Phoenix Squadron. I actually love this aspect of Star Wars Rebels. New ships being added, we see the fleet grow throughout the show, and it also sucks when we see the vessels lost.
A quick note about today's episode. The events surrounding the fall of Reach are a little messy within Halo canon, and some of the logic and timelines don't make a lot of sense, but I'll do my best to try to present everything in a logical and coherent way. Reach was protected by 20 orbital defense platforms and at its most 100 plus ships. Most of these vessels, however, were reassigned after the Covenant invasion, and the home fleet was likely fairly minimal. The Covenant invasion was kicked off by the fleet of Valiant Prudence, comprised primarily of a massive CSO supercarrier, the Long Night of Solace, and escorted by several SDV-class corvettes. The fleet of Valiant Prudence would somehow bypass all of the UNSC sensors, the orbiting fleet, and the orbital defense platforms, landing troops clandestinely on the planet. A series of stealth generators were set up, and the Covenant established a hidden beachhead. The Covenant had two preliminary planetary objectives. The first, the recovery of Forerunner assets, and the second, the neutralization of the Visigoid communication relay. During an attack on the latter, the Covenant were discovered by the Spartan Noble team, and winter contingency was declared. For several weeks then, the Covenant and UNSC engaged in open ground hostilities, the most notable of which was the Covenant attack on Oni Sword Base, which was successfully repelled. During the Battle of Surdock Ridge, the UNSC counterattacked, launching a massive raid against the Covenant landing site. It was here that the Covenant stealth generator was finally destroyed, and the presence of the CSO supercarrier was revealed to humanity. This was somewhat of a positive for humanity. I mean, they did discover the presence of the gigantic ship, but it also allowed the Covenant to put it into play, revealing to everyone involved that this was not a small strike on a human world, but rather a full-scale invasion. UNSC reinforcements from across the galaxy were summoned, however the rendezvous time was several weeks away. Realizing that the CSO, which was most likely too powerful to be challenged by conventional means and outside the range of orbital defense platforms, represented a fatal threat to the planet as a whole, Noble Team launched Operation Uppercut, where they used a jerry-rigged slip space bomb to destroy the CSO. However, minutes after their mission success, and I'm not sure if this was a coincidence or something planned, a second very large Covenant fleet appeared. Somehow these forces were able to bypass the ODP array and began glassing the planet, and in particular New Alexandria. It's not clear to me what the UNSC space response was, whether there were still any ships in system, whether they were waiting for reinforcements, conducting raids against the Covenant fleet, or engaged in a prolonged campaign. We do know, however, that soon a third and fourth force, including the fleet of Particular Justice, would arrive on planet, bringing the Covenant's assets to over 400 capital ships. In response, the UNSC massed their own fleet, although they were outnumbered 3-1 and attempted to protect the ODPs. My theory is that the Covenant found a small hole in the ODP array, but were now looking to expand their control over the planet. This was probably the most substantial space engagement of the entire campaign. As the Covenant attacked the defense platforms, several orbital repair yards put themselves in harm's way and soaked up the brunt of the damage. Before the Covenant could attack again, the defense platforms fired a volley which took down about a third of the fleet. However, that was really the only chance they had. The massive Covenant Armada fired again, this time not only destroying any nearby platforms, but also taking down most of the human fleet. The Covenant retreated out of range and began launching a massive invasion towards the planet's surface. The landed troops first targeted the ground-side orbital defense platform power generators, and although faced some Spartan resistance, were eventually successful. With the defense platforms and the fleet now nearly reduced to nothing, the Covenant were able to easily move the remaining forces onto the planet and began end-stage glassing. The only real win for the UNSC was that the Pillar of Autumn, loaded with Master Chief and Cortana, was able to escape, kicking off the events which would eventually lead to the end of the Human Covenant War. The question here is, what could the UNSC have done differently? And this is extremely difficult. The Covenant had overwhelming force. A single Covenant ship is usually superior to its UNSC counterpart, and not only did they have better ships, but here also more of them. The UNSC did have one secret plan to end the war, Operation Red Flag. This would basically involve a Spartan team kidnapping a High Covenant official, and the planet Reach was actually supposed to be somewhat involved. So today we are talking about the Battle of Kamino, the event that ends the Force Unleashed 2 story. As many of you know, sort of like Shadows of the Empire, the Force Unleashed and the Force Unleashed 2 were told not only through video games, but also tie-in novels and comics.
Strangely enough, the battle over Kamino is actually totally absent from the comic, but the novel and video game both have representations of the event which are slightly different. In this video, I'll try to make the two different sources work together cohesively as much as possible. So I'll give a broad history. After the events of The Force Unleashed, Darth Vader was struggling to create a successful clone of his former Force-sensitive apprentice Galen Merrick, otherwise known as Starkiller. One of his quote-unquote failed clones, before being eliminated by Vader, manages to escape the Kamino cloning facility. This new Starkiller begins a journey to find his love, Juno Eclipse. Eventually, Captain Eclipse of the Rebellion is captured by Boba Fett and brought to Kamino. Discovering this, Starkiller brings the Rebellion the location and details of Vader's cloning facilities, stating that he'll be going there regardless and that the Rebel fleet might as well join for a full attack. In response, the Young Alliance summons their entire fleet for what they hope will be a surprise, overwhelming assault on the planet. However, as the ships exit hyperspace, the Empire, who had been obviously luring Starkiller, are waiting. The clone, as well as General Rom Koda, are aboard the Salvation, a Nebulon B frigate which, by this point, is in pretty rough shape. It's down on fighters, it has very limited targeting capabilities, and its hyperdrive has been damaged and is somewhat slower than the rest of the fleet. The Salvation thus arrives somewhat later than the main task force. Upon exiting hyperspace, Starkiller counts, and I quote, about a dozen Rebel starships facing off against no less than 5 Imperial Star Destroyers. Now, we don't see this many ships in the Force Unleashed video game, and one of the Star Destroyers is perhaps the Gladiator cruiser that we see, but the Rebel fleet is nonetheless absolutely overwhelmed. Salvation tries to clear a path towards the planet, with Starkiller manning the guns and eliminating as many starfighters as possible. Speaking of, both sides have launched their own starfighters, with Wedge Antilles among the many Rebel pilots seeing action against the Empire. Along with starfighters, the Empire has also sent out boarding parties. Aboard the Salvation, Starkiller is able to successfully repel the boarders, and also uses the Force to superpower a turbo laser, which he uses to destroy a Star Destroyer. Nonetheless, at this time, I don't think the Rebels have any large cruisers of their own, and the fleet is barely standing up to the combined Imperial firepower. What's more, Kamino is protected by a planetary shield, making a ground assault impossible. Despite these factors, the Alliance is not willing to retreat. This is their first major battle. A retreat would be both a military failure and a serious morale killer. Starkiller is also, of course, unwilling to abandon Juno. Thankfully, he comes up with a plan. Ram Koda and all other rebels on the Salvation are ordered to abandon ship. Starkiller's plan is to force the Nebulon B through the planetary shield, then crash it into the planet-side shield generators. As he repositions the vessel, Rebel starfighters move in to provide screening cover. And as the Salvation actually heads towards the planetary shield itself, the capital ships of the Rebel fleet move in between him and the Empire. One Star Destroyer, recognizing his plan, attempts to ram the Nebulon B, but fails. The Salvation is somehow able to slip through the planetary shield, taking extreme damage, but still maintaining enough structural stability to crash into the shield generator. The Rebels send in a strike force, and on the ground are able to defeat the garrisoned Imperial troops. Starkiller disables much of the cloning facility and defeats Vader in one-on-one combat. The Sith Lord is then taken into custody by the Rebellion. In space, the battle rages on. At some point, at least one MC-80 from Admiral Ackbar on Mon Calamari joins the fray and helps turn the battle for the Rebellion. At least 3 Star Destroyers are disabled, presumably the rest of the Empire retreats, with the Rebellion maintaining control of Kamino. However, they have no interest in staying there. They gather the fleet and leave for Dantooine. However, before doing so, they crash the remains of 3 Star Destroyers into the planet-spanning ocean, causing a massive tsunami which destroys Tamira City and the Empire's cloning facilities. And that's how the Rebel Alliance successfully won the Battle of Kamino. This was a major victory. Not only was this one of the first times Mon Calamari cruisers saw action against the Empire, but it was also the first time the entire Alliance came together for a major raid against the Empire. Destroying the cloning facilities obviously saved the galaxy from a great deal of conflict, as it was seemingly one of the only locations which had the technology to overcome the difficulty with cloning Force-sensitive beings. Obviously, Vader was captured, but he would somehow escape, likely through the help of Boba Fett, who was seen following the Rebel fleet. At this point, the Death Star was stationed in the Horus system. It was still under construction and protected by a small fleet.
made up of at least several Star Destroyers. Also present is Admiral Natasi Dalla, who is arriving at the Death Star for a meeting with Tarkin. The Rebel Alliance's assault is led by a Lucrehulk-class battlecruiser, a ship which, alone, could not threaten the station, but which carried hundreds of starfighters. Immediately, active TIE fighters are ordered to form a defensive screen around the station. The Star Destroyers and the Death Star themselves are also scrambling fighters, but it's taking some time. Local capital ships are ordered to move and form a second line of defense. Although, to be honest, with the Rebel attack highly concentrated in starfighters, there's probably not a lot that the Star Destroyers themselves could do. The Lucrehulk quickly unloads 500 X-Wings in two distinct waves. The Death Star and the Defense Fleet have 1,000 TIEs to bring to bear, but it's taking some time. As the Star Destroyers continue to move into position and the TIEs continue to hold, the Death Star fires its super laser at only a 4% charge, instantly vaporizing the Rebel Lucrehulk from 2,000 kilometers away. With their flagship destroyed, the hundreds of Rebel fighters seemingly panic. The reinforcement TIEs are not in position, and the Alliance actually has a fairly straight shot at the Death Star, with their first wave of about 250 X-Wings actually outnumbering the 120 TIEs. While closing the distance, the X-Wings attack and disable Dalla's ship, but by the time they're in firing range of the TIEs, none of them engage, instead attempting to blow by and attack the Death Star itself. This ends up being disastrous, and the X-Wings are massacred. By the time the second line arrives, the perimeter has been reinforced with TIEs from the Death Star and Star Destroyers. The second wave of rebels runs into a brick wall against over 4 times as many fighters, and the Empire is able to eliminate all rebel starfighters while losing less than 100 of their own. Now obviously the X-Wings' choice to basically turn their backs to the TIE fighters while also attempting to outrace the TIEs was a terrible one. Although the Imperial starfighters were caught flat-footed, they were still able to adapt and put fire on the defenseless ships. That being said, although the assault was an unmitigated disaster, I do think the Alliance had a shot here. But let's examine their strategy with a bit more depth. First, why did the Alliance even bother bringing the Lucrehulk? It was honestly just a target, and X-Wings possess hyperdrives. I mean, perhaps there were fuel concerns, but if not, I'd ditch the capital ship entirely. It's just too big of a target, and realistically, cannot hope to damage an enemy Star Destroyer, much less the Death Star. But even if we bring the Lucrehulk, the fighter management on the Rebel side was absolutely atrocious. X-Wings are far superior to TIE fighters. They should have put the pressure on the first defensive wave, instead of trying to slip by. That being said, I understand the need to hit the station quickly, so here's a good compromise. Swap 200 X-Wings out for the fastest fighter you have, which can also carry torpedoes. The A-Wing would have been a perfect choice for this role, but in Legends, the ship wasn't invented until after Yavin. I think the R-22 or maybe even a Republic starfighter would suit the purpose well. The goal here is to use a Garm Bell Iblis style A-Wing slash on a very large scale. The first line of fighters is made up totally of X-Wings, while the second line is the fast movers. However, these fast movers are supposed to appear like X-Wings, so they maintain formation and speed. The X-Wings fully engage the defensively positioned TIEs. Once it's time for the second row to join the attack, they instead break off and accelerate at full speed. This really leaves the defense flat-footed, and now with 200 fighters being shot straight at the Death Star. This is a better strategy because it doesn't leave your attack ships undefended, but it maintains the same hit-and-run type of attack style, however, just with an element of surprise. It would be interesting to see how the defensive fleet reacts here. Some of the TIE fighters might turn to chase, in which case the X-Wings will be able to easily mop them up, sort of like how the TIE fighters did in the actual scenario. The fast movers will really have no resistance at this point. The Star Destroyers are too far out of range and the TIEs haven't launched yet. They will have to avoid the large turbolasers of the Death Star itself, but this is why using fast moving fighters instead of X-Wings actually makes more sense. So we're still doing the risky balls to the walls type attack on the super weapon, but with tactics and fighters more well suited for that type of attack. Now, to be honest, destroying the Death Star probably isn't likely, even though it is under construction. Instead, I would have the 200 fighters do one really clean pass on the station, unloading as much weaponry as possible. If the X-Wings manage to clear out the ties before the reinforcements arrive, then they can follow suit. However, Imperial reinforcements are coming, and at this point I think it's more important to actually live to fight for another day. So after that first run, hyperspace out of there. That way you still have the fighters available for a second attack later. If that's the case, you might actually want to bring the Lucrehulk, that way you can conserve fuel for the initial jump and have the starfighters jump away individually. Then you can regroup, continue to scout out the system, and if a second opportunity presents itself, attack again. This is how the Rebel Alliance best works, with flexible, non-committal assaults, rather than attempting to straight up outfight the Empire with sheer numbers. The main responsibilities of the Imperial Navy were the projection of force and the guarding of Imperial assets. These two obligations took many forms, from hunting down the Rebel Alliance to escorting and supporting other branches of the military to protecting shipping lanes and key planets. With a far more militaristic and fascist approach to governing when compared to the Republic, the Empire created a navy which ballooned to a totally unmanageable size. In an effort to deal with the overwhelming logistics of maintaining a strong presence across the galaxy while also dealing with chronic shortages in staffing and resources, the Empire highly regulated its military starships. On an individual level, personnel were heavily specialized and typically kept to themselves, or at least within their own groups. Organizationally, Imperial forces were also divided based on purpose. The Navy was positioned across the galaxy within sector groups. Sector groups were themselves made up of several subfleets and typically contained thousands of ships, including a few dozen star destroyers. In the later years of the Empire, many astrographically proximate sectors were grouped into even larger oversectors and controlled by Grand Moffs or other very high-ranking military or political leaders. Important assets like super star destroyers were often assigned to oversectors. Now, as a note, after Endor, some High Admirals or Grand Moffs, like Warlord Zinj, were able to consolidate power within their large regions of space, offering significant resistance to the New Republic. So to recap, we have 20 or so oversectors, with each oversector made up of sector fleets and sector fleets comprised of subfleets. Now, these subfleets perform different roles, from bombardment to space superiority to planetary assault. Obviously, based on their specific role, subfleets often had to rely on each other. The Rebel Alliance was known to target Imperial deep lock fleets and their shipyards, which were responsible for repairing, restocking, and maintaining the other ships within the sector. So in other words, by targeting this one specific subfleet, the whole Imperial sector fleet is unable to operate. Unsurprisingly, commanding officer rank would decrease as unit size decreased. System forces, for example, fell under the command of Commodores or High Admirals, but the Commodore was ultimately responsible to the local High Admiral, the Oversector Grand Moff if present, and, of course, the Emperor himself. Fleets could be further broken up into squadrons commanded by admirals and lines, the smallest unit commanded by captains. Something like a single Star Destroyer could constitute a line, as would several cruisers, or a few dozen smaller ships, and I do find it interesting that the Empire is stretched so thin with their officers that in many cases, individual ships would be commanded by lieutenants, the officer rank below a captain, while captains would be responsible for many ships themselves. Of course, besides for the general organizational definitions within the Imperial Order of Battle, specially designed fleets would have protected hundreds, if not thousands, of unique Imperial assets, from worlds within the core, to research installations, to shipping lanes. We also see purpose-built fleets like Death Squadron assembled and assigned mission objectives. This gave the Force more mobility, which is a good thing, I believe, but I'll talk about that later. So, although Imperial subfleets were purportedly specialized, this ceases when we examine the Empire on a ship-based level. The mainline battleship and the backbone of every Imperial fleet, regardless of purpose, was the Imperial Star Destroyer. The Empire constructed tens of thousands of these vessels, and used them as the building block for, as I said, every major fleet they operated. Imperial Star Destroyer groups were supposed to be protected and accompanied by support fleets. However, as we see with the Battle of Endor, that didn't always happen. And it should be noted that for the thousands of ships which supposedly supported a single Star Destroyer,
Many, perhaps even the majority of them, would have been totally unsuitable for combat. Things like transports, medical ships, refueling ships, etc., etc. Less important areas of space would obviously be given less assets, and many sectors, or at least systems, probably were not within range of a Star Destroyer. Patrol duties then fell to smaller vessels, particularly Victory Star Destroyers. Victories, however, were old and slow, meaning that, although the ships were significantly smaller, they weren't any more effective at rapid response. This was problematic, given that they were often responsible for fighting pirates in small, mobile rebel cells. Imperial cruisers were almost uniformly complemented by TIE fighter variants, and the majority of them were simple TIE fighters, interceptors, or bombers. As we saw throughout the Galactic Civil War, starfighters, especially when combined with the lumbering Imperial ships that they escorted, were easily countered by the Alliance. However, despite this glaring weakness, improved or experimental TIEs would never see widespread galaxy-wide use, which is a real shame. Scrap a few Dreadnoughts and instead put those resources into TIE defenders, and you can much more effectively respond to rebel fleets. When it came to battle tactics, the Empire's main weakness was actually catching and finding their opponents. So, strategy itself often came down to overwhelming the enemy with unmatchable firepower. Of course, individual commanders would make use of distinct tactics, depending on the scenario they were facing, but, unlike with the Alliance, it's difficult to pick out trends or common maneuvers, other than favoring Star Destroyer broadsides and hard-hitting frontal assaults. Of course, the general principles of space warfare, like protecting your large ships with point defense cannons and screening starfighters, was more or less adhered to. We see this blunt strategy because Imperial military actions were dictated by the Tarkin Doctrine, which promoted order through fear and power. Shows of force were important, from the prominence of Imperial Star Destroyers within the Navy, ships that, while frightening, were not particularly practical, to the creation of superweapons and the serious oppression of the rights of citizens. The creation of sector navies and their organization into 20-plus oversectors was also seen as a means to create uniformity and order, both important concepts within the Tarkin Doctrine. However, this removed much of the Empire's flexibility, which the rebels exploited by striking at the edge of one sector, engaging the local fleet, then retreating and striking elsewhere. Territorial, power-hungry Moffs often cared little about greater overall Imperial warfare, and instead cared most about territorial security and prosperity. I think a better Imperial strategy would have been a higher reliance on roving defense fleets, with more assets directed to hunting down the rebels. Let's be honest, the Alliance didn't have the means to wage a campaign through the inner and deep core. You could easily take 25% of the assets there, still protecting against pirates and any roving fleets, while making a handful of battle groups with the sole purpose of hunting the Alliance. I've talked before about how the Empire often talks the talk when it comes to fear and power projection. However, they were overly defensive and didn't walk the walk. When they engage the Alliance directly with something like Death Squadron, we see that the Empire can be incredibly effective at disrupting Alliance activity and destroying assets. My point is, while I do admit that the oversector system was smart, it was militarily and certainly politically efficient, it was over-relied upon during the Galactic Civil War. With the Navy, you have one main battleship, the Star Destroyer, and some support ships. That right there is not a lot of flexibility. Still, you could work with this. Instead, the Empire chose to double down on this inflexibility, and that's how we get the Alliance winning the Galactic Civil War. In 2552, Earth remained far and away the most important human colony in the Halo universe. Today, I tell the story of its fall. Besides for a home fleet, Earth's primary defenses were 300 Supermac orbital weapons platforms. The stations were organized in battle groups of 3 and protected the planet from every angle. On October 20th, 2552, Covenant whispers were heard within the Sol system for the first time ever. The first force to arrive at Earth was the Fleet of Sacred Consecration, led by the Prophet of Regret. The force, which was absolutely puny considering the importance of Earth, immediately converged on the Athens-Cairo-Malta defense cluster, hoping to punch a hole through the orbital array and reach the surface. The ODPs were primed almost instantly, however, the Covenant had jumped outside of the kill zone, which I've represented with a red circle, so they could not be fired on right away. The UNSC home fleet, which at this point in the war had been cannibalized to help reinforce other battle groups,
moved into position to protect the defense platforms. In total, the UNSC had about 8 Marathon cruisers, 70 frigates, and a few other miscellaneous capital ships at their disposal. The UNSC was not forced to hold position for long, and the Covenant entered the kill zone and pushed toward the planet. While pushing, the Covenant engaged with UNSC forces heavily, resulting in massive losses on both sides. While this was happening, Covenant strike teams successfully destroyed the Athens and Malta defense stations, though Master Chief was able to disarm the bomb meant for the Cairo. Still, a hole was made and the Covenant exploited it. One CAS-class carrier, shrugging off fire from both defense platforms and cruisers, was able to make its way to the planet's surface. The rest of the fleet remained engaged in orbit. The second CAS was destroyed after UNSC longswords pierced a hole in its hull, which Master Chief exploited, using the previously disarmed Covenant bomb against its creators. Over the city of New Mombasa, the Prophet of Regret jumped away from Earth, granting somewhat of a reprieve to the defenders below, but also devastating much of the city through the slipspace jump itself. Shortly after, an even more massive armada, this time with over 30 capital ships, including 3 CAS carriers, arrived and began to engage humanity across the planet. Although other UNSC assets were recalled, by this point things were not looking good for humanity and the planet was being dominated. Still, it was clear that Truth's forces were not looking to conquer the planet, but were instead searching for something. On November 17th, 2552, High Charity's Forerunner Dreadnought and the Prophet of Truth himself arrived on Earth, likely facing almost no resistance. Covenant forces activated the portal to the Ark and, with that, left immediately. However, the hardship was not over. Immediately after this, the Indulgence of Conviction, a flood-controlled CCS-class cruiser, crash-landed on Africa. Anti-Covenant Sangheili would follow, and the fleet of 10 were able to eradicate the infection from the planet, although half of the continent was fully destroyed. The Fleet of Retribution, as it was known, along with the Forward Unto Dawn, a UNSC frigate, followed Truth's forces through the portal, leaving Earth, now destroyed, but without any major threats or protectors. Most of the UNSC home fleet had been completely obliterated. I mean, High Command can only spare 3 frigates when they believe the Ark is about to be activated. Thankfully, no other attackers would come, and the seriously crippled Earth would be given time to rebuild. Today, we're picking up a thread first introduced in the Thrawn duology, the bombing of Caamas. The bombing of Caamas was one of the first atrocities committed by the Empire, occurring in 19 BBY, the same year the Republic transitioned to the New Order. The Caamasi of Caamas were a very well-known, old, wise, and loved species within the galaxy. They were totally against war and friends with any species who encountered them. Of course, newly minted Emperor Palpatine saw this unifying force as a threat to his new regime. He, along with several pro-Imperial traitorous Bothans, came up with a scheme. A fleet of Star Destroyers was moved into orbit, and on the surface of Caamas, the Bothans sabotaged the planetary shield. This left the planet totally vulnerable, and in what may have been the Empire's first ever base Delta Zero, they annihilated nearly all life on the planet over the course of several hours. There was unbridled sorrow and outrage across the galaxy. The Caamas were almost a totally innocent species, and as I mentioned, they were incredibly well loved. Of course, Palpatine hid the fact that the Empire actually perpetrated the attack, although his involvement was suspected among many in the galaxy, particularly after the Battle of Endor. In fact, the official story was that the Confederacy of Independent Systems was the one who perpetrated the attack, continuing to vilify not only droids, but also non-human aliens. Nearly 40 years later, in 19 ABY, the Caamas atrocity returned to the public consciousness. This was through the leaking of the Caamas document, which confirmed that the Empire was in fact a party to the destruction, a fact that wasn't particularly surprising, and that the Bothans helped to lower the planetary shield. The outrage was reignited, and there were protests across the galaxy calling for the punishment of the entire Bothan race. Unfortunately, no specific Bothans were named in the Caamas document, and the Bothans financially were not in the position to pay reparations. So the New Republic was in a very difficult position, especially as any attempts to mediate violence or anti-Bothan sentimentality was seen as endorsing a war crime. The crisis would end when Luke and Mara Jade would collect the original Caamas document and reveal that the Empire, or at least a small portion of it, had been purposely trying to manipulate public sentiment while also engineering an eventual attack on the Republic. Those efforts notwithstanding, after the crisis, the Imperial Remnant, as led at this point by Admiral Pelion, would make peace with the New Republic, spelling the true end of the Galactic Civil War, and things would be good in the galaxy at least for 6 years until the invasion of the Yuuzhan Vong in 25 ABY. But let's talk about the Battle of Kashyyyk, and that's actually probably too broad of a term for what we're discussing. The Confederacy had actually been on Kashyyyk for some time before the final battle. Efforts were made to weaken local Wookiee resistance and also destroy Republic military units. In response, the Republic launched a mobile hit-and-run campaign against the Separatist forces, but it ultimately wasn't very successful. However, all of this changed as the Separatist forces began to mass for a large-scale attack on a single target. The CIS were targeting the Wookiee city of Kashyyyk, a unique strategic location for a couple of reasons. First, it was near a very important energy production facility, which the CIS wanted to eliminate, and secondly, it had far less foliage than most other Wookiee cities on Kashyyyk. In response, and with the arrival of Master Yoda, the Republic consolidated their forces and coordinated with the Wookiees for a large-scale defense of the city. Notable Republic assets included not only a wide range of heavy vehicles, but also portions of the elite 41st and 501st Legions. The Republic had somewhat of an advantage on defense. First of all, the beach they were protecting had natural and Wookiee-made reinforcements, including a large beachhead, as well as large trees, towers, and other defensive emplacements. What's more, the only way into the city was through a lagoon, which funneled somewhat the forces of the CIS, making them easy targets for dug-in units and Republic marksmen. What's more, while they had to eventually cross through a narrow point, during the cross of the lagoon itself, Separatist forces were left in the open and particularly vulnerable to attacks on their flanks. Well, how does this actually play out? So, the seawall was used as a key defensive point for the Wookiee and Republic forces. Troopers were massed there in an attempt to blunt any Separatist attack. And that's really how it began. The Separatists charged across the lagoon using droid tanks, dwarf spider droids, and infantry, while not only being shot by faraway Republic troops, but also facing Wookiees in cover. The Republic responded with numerous AT-APs, AT-RTs, and Juggernaut tanks. The Juggernauts especially brought a lot more firepower and tonnage than anything available to the Separatists. In the air, HMP gunships and Republic speeders went head-to-head, and although it seems like the Confederacy would have a fairly huge advantage in this area because of the mismatch, the Wookiees were at least able to stop the gunships from dominating in the air and taking out ground units. Back to overall strategy though, the Separatists likely had more forces, but the Republic strategy of digging in, defending, and blunting the enemy attack was working fairly well. With the CIS fully committed, the Republic used their secret weapon, the Jedi Quinlan Vos and Luminara Unduli. We learn that Master Unduli, along with the portion of the 41st Elite, viciously attacked the Separatist flank, a vulnerability that was obvious from the get-go, while Quinlan Vos attacked the Separatist base in an effort to ensure that no reinforcements would be able to help the now suffering Separatist army. By the time of Order 66, a Republic victory was more or less ensured. The chaos caused by the Order itself did give the CIS some chance to try to counterattack. However, nothing major was accomplished, and before long, the droid deactivation switch was flipped, which ended the Clone Wars anyway. So this is an interesting battle because I think it shows the desperation of the Confederacy. Kashyyyk would be a very hard world to attack. The terrain is incredibly difficult, and Wookiees are among the fiercest warriors in the galaxy. For that reason, you can kind of understand why they attacked Kashyyyk Beach. However, I just don't think victory was possible. The Republic had too many defensive emplacements. They were totally content with just sitting and allowing the Separatists to funnel themselves through a small area, while also being able to attack their flanks. And with that being said, I think the Republic played this basically as well as they could have. What about the Separatists though? What would have been a better strategy? It's hard to say. Based on what we see in Revenge of the Sith, yes, it does appear like the Separatists do have an advantage when it comes to air superiority. So one could argue that they would have been better off just striking at the Republic and trying to destroy any of their defensive emplacements, maybe catching the forest on fire or something. But we know that the Republic had a landed Venator, they had a ton of supplies. I think it's very unlikely that they wouldn't have been able to scramble V-Wings or LATs or ARC 170s or something had the need arisen. The UNSC's major mistake at the Battle of Earth was their failure to rely on and protect the planet's extensive supermac defensive grid. The question is, how and why did this happen? The UNSC isn't frequently portrayed as stupid, and they certainly aren't here. They're able to identify the tactics of the Covenant quite well, even from very early on, which is a great first step. They recognize that the cruisers are purposefully staying out of MAC firing range, while smaller transports are spotted heading towards the orbital defense platforms in order to punch a hole through the grid. Admiral Hood even notes how valuable the stations are, and keeps the fleet in place to protect them. What's more, the UNSC had advanced notice that something was going wrong, as Cortana reports to Hood,
"Another whisper, sir, near Io. We have probes en route."
Suggesting not only that there was a sign of incoming danger, but that humanity was concerned enough with the threat that alerts were being sent directly to UNSC High Command. So they've recognized the threat and identified tactics. How did things go so wrong? The battle is basically over within the first hour. The Athens and Malta ODPs are destroyed, allowing the Covenant warships to both A, move into position to decimate the UNSC fleet, and B, push through the defensive line to Earth's surface. After that, any subsequent fleets are able to push through the existing hole or make new ones without having to face any resistance from the fleet. The main problem is the UNSC realizes what is happening but doesn't actually respond in a meaningful way. The fleet moves and forms a defensive perimeter but doesn't intelligently engage the main threat, the boarding parties. I think this is because the UNSC was too worried about the warships themselves. We see, for example, that longswords are flying into position with UNSC fleets, not racing off to intercept the boarding craft, which do not appear to be particularly fast, maneuverable, or well armed. And the fleet is positioned to protect against the Covenant capital ships, which actually have to stay out of the fight lest they be destroyed. I'm not sure whether this bias existed just because of how fearsome the Covenant fleet was and the fact that having your homeworld attacked is frightening, or whether the UNSC just underestimated Covenant borders. So the Covenant telegraphed their movements pretty clearly. If I were in command, here's what I would have done. All UNSC frigates would have been ordered to move into position close to the orbital defense platforms. These ships are armed with pretty impressive point defense cannons and would have helped out in taking down boarding parties. It's true, the Covenant could have feinted and instead attacked a different trio of MAC platforms, but I believe I would have been able to respond. Actually moving the frigates into position is probably the least important part of my plan. In reality, the boarding transports are the easiest targets ever. They're not meant for direct combat, and the Covenant fleet is totally incapable of supporting them because of the ODP kill range. I would order any launched longswords to move and intercept the borders. As that's happening, any station side, ship side, and hell, even planet side longswords would also be moved to help protect against further starfighters. Without having your ODPs taken down from the inside, I don't think there's anything the Covenant can do. The only real way to destroy a MAC platform is by sheer overwhelming force, or by attacking outside the weapon's firing arc, which is difficult given the fact that the stations can rotate. The fleet that attacked Reach was more than 10 times the size of the one that attacked Earth, with almost 1,000 ships. Reach also only had 20 orbital defense platforms instead of 300, and they still managed to destroy hundreds of ships. I believe 300 ODPs represents a more or less impenetrable force, immune to any traditional attack. That's why I feel comfortable moving literally every asset I have to protect against the ODP's one vulnerability: small, fast-moving starfighters and perhaps very small capital ships. Remember, the ODPs themselves have defense turrets, and we've got mostly frigates and longswords. And it's not like the Covenant blitzed the station either, because the ships actually started outside of the kill zone, launched from the main cruisers. So there's more than enough time to mount an intelligent response, and that's ignoring the fact that really, the frigates should have been in position anyway. There is no Covenant capital ship with perhaps
perhaps the exception of the CSO supercarrier, which can survive a shot from a Super Mac platform. The Macs can also fire multiple times a minute. They can handle the big things. I really believe that as long as you can clear out any attackers, that the stations would be fine. I also don't believe that the later arrival of Truth's fleet would have provided enough forces to overwhelm Earth's defenses. For one, we know that the ships were being captained by brutes who probably wouldn't have a good understanding of how the ODPs worked, and with ships not able to actually breach the line, an invasion of Earth would be very difficult. However, not impossible. While it's pretty clear that no large Covenant carriers would be able to make it to the surface, we still would have to worry about smaller ships attacking. And one of the main weaknesses for orbital defense platforms were their ground-based generators. I would have as many anti-aircraft cannons set up around the ODP generators as possible, and would station as many assets as possible nearby to protect them. The main point of my plan here is that I would never go on the offensive, even with my larger cruisers. The array makes traditional attack, at least in my opinion, impossible. So move everything else into a defensive position and let it do its job. I find it somewhat ridiculous that with the point defense cannons of the station, the many ships, and the longsword fighters, that boarding craft were ever able to even make it near to the ODPs, and I really think the destruction of the Athens and Malta and the compromising of Earth's defense grid could have been prevented. The Star Wars galaxy is an interesting place. Large, central governments manage galactic affairs, while individual systems generally maintain a high degree of autonomy. Understanding this relationship is crucial for any wannabe smuggler or pirate. Local governments, not the Republic or the Empire or whoever else, are typically the ones fielding local defense fleets and custom registries. Thus, step one of any good pirate raid is picking a target. Let's be honest, unless you're Zim the Despot, you and your buddies are probably not going to want to harass Coruscant. It has strong orbital and ground-based defenses, a planetary shield, and a dedicated space force protecting it at all times. Instead, you want a planet which, despite having some commercial activity, is a little bit more of a backwater. However, choosing a target is a bit more involved to that. You also have to decide whether you want to raid the planet itself, which is difficult, or to target spaceships within the gravity well. I think the latter is a better option, as it's much quicker and less risky. Planets in the Star Wars galaxy act as hubs and are generally the last stop before ships jump to hyperspace. So this means that even a generic backwards planet probably has a few targets within striking distance. But let's say you've done all of that basic groundwork and you're now organizing the raid itself. Step one is always knowing your target. Have someone scout the planet out beforehand and preferably remain there until the raid is launched. Figure out what loot is available for grabbing, and identify any defenses or obstructions. With that accomplished, you then move on to developing and implementing a strategy. I want to highlight one that I particularly like, the custom red trick. We see this used, albeit unsuccessfully because of the presence of Han and Luke, during the raid of Iphigenia. Han Solo explains it better than I can. It's an old trick. You call an alert on some ship coming in sunside, then hit a nightside target while Customs is busy half a planet away. The only tricky part is making sure the ground and orbit defenses can't get to you, plus figuring out how to fake the alert in the first place. So Iphigenia does not have a major defense fleet, but it does have a goal and defense platform and custom ships. Pirates hoping to raid space traffic around the planet call in a customs red alert on just a random freighter. They do so by securing New Republic credentials. A custom red code basically means that the ship is hauling extremely dangerous and illegal material. The ship they choose to target is one on the sun side of the planet, also in line with the goal and defense platform. In response to what they think is an extraordinarily dangerous situation, Iphigenian customs officials all move to intercept the ship. As a hint, one thing you can do to make this plan even more successful is use local geopolitical conflicts. For example, let's say you're a pirate operating 18 years after the Battle of Yavin. Go to one of the fringe Corellian planets, say Socoria, and tell custom officials that a Drawl or Solonian ship is approaching with some dangerous cargo. But back to the case study. With local defenses now distracted and out of the way, the pirates at Iphigenia target a Republic transport on the opposite side of the planet. The raid at Iphigenia is not successful because Han Solo, who himself is quite familiar with the criminal underworld, recognizes what's going on. He and Luke are able to overwhelm the pirates who were targeting a New Republic transport. And again, this is one of the keys of picking your targets and doing a bit of basic research. If I knew Han Solo was on the planet or that there was a major trade summit or negotiation happening, you'd probably want to go somewhere else.
Although, in Return of the Jedi, we see the citizens of Coruscant seemingly revolting against the Empire shortly after the Battle of Endor, the planet would not be fully liberated until nearly 3 years later. By 7 ABY, Coruscant would become the new capital for the New Republic, and of course the center, again, of the entire galaxy. But only a few months earlier, towards the end of 6 ABY, Izani Isard, having killed most of the Imperial ruling council, was still held up on Imperial Center, which was protected by strong planetary defenses. As the New Republic battled to capture the hearts, minds, and of course planets of the galaxy, they made the securing of Coruscant, or as was often known during the era, Imperial Center, an absolute priority, even above fighting off Imperial warlords. So the New Republic pushed towards the core, they established bases, and covert agents were also sent to Coruscant to gauge planetary defenses. However, it was made obvious that the New Republic would not be able to assault Coruscant directly. Their naval force just wasn't large enough, and Coruscant was too well defended. We get the following quote from Wedge's Gamble, Book 2 of the X-Wing series. "To take Coruscant, we must eliminate the shields. There are a number of ways to do this, but none of them are simple. A direct assault would cost us more dearly than both Death Star battles combined." This was because, as Admiral Ackbar explained, the Golan defense platforms and especially the planetary shield made it so Coruscant could hold out, even without a navy. And speaking of, the actual space forces around the planet were paltry, only perhaps a few Star Destroyers. But obviously Coruscant did have one of the strongest planetary shields in the entire galaxy, so just bombarding it didn't seem practical. One option was to blockade the planet, but that just didn't seem practical, as it would leave the New Republic fleet in a single position for too long, and it would also give Isard the time to summon reinforcements, perhaps even Super Star Destroyers. So another plan was developed, which saw Rogue Squadron inserted incognito to the planet's surface alongside several criminals who had been negotiated from the prisons of Kessel, basically to start trouble. Their goal was to take down the planet's defensive systems from within. Now, as a note, there was a degree of internal strife within the team, mostly surrounding Tycho Selku, who had been abducted and taken to Isard's Lusankia prison sometime earlier, which was known for brainwashing individuals and re-embedding them to their faction, only to have them turn on their allies. So that made all of this a bit more difficult. So initial plans were discussed for how to take down the planetary shield. I'm going to talk about that a different day, especially Wedge's trip to the Galactic Museum. But for right now, it's simple enough to say that the first plan was to take down the shields through Coruscant's computer systems. However, that was determined to be a non-viable plan. The second plan was far more convoluted, but is the one the New Republic ended up going with. So there are 3 pieces of background information that are crucial to understanding Rogue Squadron's plan. First of all, the Coruscant planetary shield received its power from planet-side generators. Obviously, the Coruscant electrical system was extraordinarily sophisticated. However, there were enough critical components within a single proximate area that it was not infallible, especially to terrorism or some sort of attack. Second, Coruscant was weather controlled, primarily through large orbital mirrors, which reflected the light of the system's sun. These could be moved and operated to strategically distribute energy. Third, the cityscape of Coruscant was constantly changing, and one of the ways this was accomplished was through the use of large constructor droids. Constructor droids were basically multi-story bulldozers. They would take down buildings and use the material to create new ones, depending on the needs of the planet. So Rogue Squadron's plan was 3-pronged, and again, this is fairly insane. The first team, led by Wedge Antilles, was sent to capture one of the Imperial constructor droids. The second team, led by Corran Horn, was to protect the droid from the air, and they were armed with headhunters. Wedge was to alter the course of the droid, moving it to
towards one of the orbital mirror stations. It was known that Imperial procedure would dictate that the station be evacuated, at which point the third team, including Winter, Tycho Selku, and the Gand Oral, would infiltrate the station and take control of the planet's orbital mirrors. So the plan basically goes off without a hitch. The Empire does eventually realize what's going on and dispatches TIE fighters, as well as defenses from Coruscant's buildings. The Walker is defended by Team 2, and Team 3 manages to infiltrate the station. We get a nice perspective from the cousin of Captain Nita, who is the commanding officer on the mirror platform, as the station repositions to direct immense amounts of energy onto Coruscant's surface. This causes massive storms. Unfortunately, the storms themselves, while capable of destroying much of the infrastructure essential to keeping the shields up, does not manage to totally destroy everything. Thus, one of Rogue Squadron's best pilots, Corran Horn, is sent not only to destroy the final relay station, but to do so, and I quote Wedge here, while outrunning lightning. Corran manages not only to hit the station with 2 missiles, but with the help of Rogue Squadron, also rams a TIE interceptor into the target. The attack is successful, Coruscant loses power, and the shields fall. This is, of course, only one aspect of the battle. As Wedge launched his assault, the New Republic fleet was jumping from a nearby star system towards Coruscant. An interdictor cruiser was placed between the jump point and Coruscant, so the ships could be pulled out of hyperspace should the shields not be disabled in time. Rogue Squadron accomplished their goal with only 10 seconds or so remaining before the cutoff point, and the fleet proceeded. Here we get another quote from Lieutenant Nita. His ability to recognize the 2 ships, 2 Star Destroyers that had just jumped in, pleased him, which is why he wondered about the underlying sense of unease slowly creeping into his heart. About the time one of the long, gently curved Mon Calamari battlecruisers reverted and swung into the line, he recalled the Accuser and Adjudicator had both been captured at Endor by the Rebels. More and more Rebel ships poured from hyperspace, big ships, small ships, snub fighters, freighters, frigates, and corvettes, each of them pulled into line with the heavier ships. The battlecruisers and destroyers formed a central layer, with ships diminishing in size and strength as they stretched from equator to pole in the northern hemisphere. So with the shield down, the Empire only had 2 Victory Star Destroyers and a set of goal and defense platforms protecting the planet. The Victories intercepted as much firepower as they could, while the Golan 3s pounded away at the Rebel fleet, destroying numerous smaller ships. Thankfully, Rogue Squadron on the ground still had control of the orbital mirror and used it to destroy a key defense platform. This allowed the fleet to move in and attack the 2 Victories directly. The 2 New Republic Star Destroyers and the Home One split the Victories down the middle and hit them with broadsides, while the Mon Ramonda and MC-80B cut in front of them, also firing broadsides. Smaller ships and other cruisers both continued to overwhelm the Star Destroyers and also spread out to prepare and watch for possible reinforcements. However, the battle was beyond ended at this point, and due to overwhelming force, both Star Destroyers actually surrendered and were added to the New Republic fleet, a great victory. From that point, the ground invasion began. First, a strike team was sent to take out some of the Imperial sensors and communication equipment, which would make the invasion difficult. Then larger forces were landed. Unfortunately, after crashing his headhunter, Corran Horn was presumed dead, though was actually captured by and aboard the Lusankya. Also unfortunate though is the fact that Izani Isard realized she couldn't hold Coruscant forever and was fully prepared to cede it to the New Republic. However, she did so after poisoning it with the CHRISTOPHSIS virus, an illness which affects primarily non-humans. She would later escape in the Lusankya itself in one of the craziest Star Wars Legends moments of all time.
In 7 ABY, the New Republic, after months of planning, captured Coruscant. As I covered in my recent chronology of the post-Endor Legends timeline, between Thrawn, the Dark Empire, and Abeloth, Coruscant was in for a very rough few decades, but at this point, there was one very pressing issue: the CHRISTOPHSIS virus. The CHRISTOPHSIS virus, which targeted aliens and caused an incredibly painful and unpleasant death, had been unleashed purposefully by Imperial Head of State Izani Isard as she fled the planet. Her plan was to bleed the New Republic dry, as the CHRISTOPHSIS virus was only treatable with the very expensive medical agent known as Bacta, and to hurt general confidence in the new government. What's worse, Izani Isard was about to do everything she could to make Bacta very, very scarce, leading to, unsurprisingly, the Bacta War, where Izani Isard and the New Republic fought for control of the galaxy's Bacta as the lives of trillions hanged in the balance. So Isard traveled to the planet Thyferra and was able to take control of the Zukfra Bacta cartel and was also elevated to Thyferran head of state, essentially controlling a significant portion of the galaxy's Bacta during a time when the New Republic, of course, needed it more than ever. In what I think was a fairly dubious call, the New Republic refused to authorize a campaign against Isard, with the argument being that they'd be interfering with the self-determination of the sovereign state, which of course would be a major turnoff for any systems looking to join the New Republic. Isard technically hadn't invaded Thyferra. She had been made chief of the Zukfra Bacta Corporation and was just essentially head of state. Now, I call this dubious because Isard was a war criminal who had attempted to genocide trillions upon trillions of sentient beings. I think it actually looks worse for the New Republic not to respond to this, but whatever. Because the New Republic would not act, Wedge, Corran Horn, and other members of Rogue Squadron resigned and publicly declared that they would liberate Thyferra, beginning their private war against Isard. Rogue Squadron was completely without formal support of the New Republic, although they did have access to 10 million credits and saw popular support within the galaxy. Various members of the New Republic Navy also continued to work with Rogue Squadron in an unofficial context. Their fighters, for example, were listed as surplus in a way that made them very easy for them to pick up. And by working with Pash Kraken, they were able to secure a base of operations in the Yogg-Dual system. Now, this was a perfect location because Yogg-Dual was midway between Coruscant and Thyferra. It was within the response radius of Pash Kraken's fighter squadron. If the rogues needed help, it would probably not be considered by Isard. And it was actually an Empress-class space station, which itself was somewhat defensible. Additionally, Rogue Squadron secured the assistance of Twi'lek freedom fighters and reached out to various smuggler groups. Rogue Squadron's mission was to liberate Thyferra. That required both successfully taking the planet on the ground and eliminating space resistance, the latter of which will be the main focus for this video. The Empire had 4 ships: the Super Star Destroyer Lusankia, the Imperial Star Destroyers Avarice and Virulence, and the Victory Star Destroyer Corruptor. Making matters more difficult was the fact that the rogues needed to avoid destroying the Lusankia, as there were New Republic prisoners on board, prisoners Corran Horn had promised to free. Rogue Squadron was clearly outgunned, so their strategy was very rebel in nature. They were going to spread out Azani Isard's capital ships, and they would do so by raiding the Bacta convoys leading Thyferra. This would not only harm Isard's bottom line, but would also allow the free sending of Bacta across the galaxy, and would force Isard to dedicate her ships to defensive duties, thus splitting them up. Additionally, the rogues also supported local Thyferran rebel groups, just to help ferment the chaos. This strategy was actually very successful. The rogues deprived Isard of over 1 billion credits of profit during their first raid, and were also whittling down Imperial fighters, especially during hit-and-run attacks. Isard, however, responded brutally by bombarding worlds which accepted free Bacta and also subjugating the local Vratex of Thyferra. As the campaign progressed, the Victory Star Destroyer Corruptor was destroyed at the Alderaan asteroid field, where Rogue Squadron also gained control of the Alderaan warcruiser Valiant. Later, Ser Lonka, commander of the ISD Avarice, defected to the Rebel Alliance alongside his ship and his crew, with the ISD being renamed the Freedom. This brings us to the actual battle itself. By now, Rogue Squadron had accumulated money, assets, support, and even famed smuggler Booster Tarek, who was running the logistics side of their station. They were ready for a final confrontation against Isard, fearing her increasingly unhinged and aggressive action against local civilian populations on Thyferra and neighboring systems. The rogues had been trading with Talon Card, but had discovered a mole within his operation who had been leaking information to Isard. They used this to set the ultimate trap. I'll explain. First, Rogue Squadron purchased several hundred torpedo launchers. The launchers themselves were separated from their targeting systems and formed the basis of an incredibly risky plan. You might need a bit of background here. Active targeting systems in the Star Wars universe, like those on munitions launchers, are detectable by enemy ships, which is why you hear pilots in Star Wars talk about target locks and whatever else. The ordnance in the actual launchers were attached to freighters, while the targeting systems were placed on the Empress space station. This dramatically increased the apparent power of the Empress, because any ship which attacked it would see hundreds of torpedoes locking on. Of course, the Empress was all bark and no bite, because as I mentioned, the missiles themselves were on the freighters. On the other hand, Rogue Squadron set up a system where the missile and torpedo-loaded freighters would slave their targeting to the telemetry of Rogue Squadron's snub fighters. Basically, an X-Wing could get a target, feed it to the freighters, and they could almost covertly launch the missiles. Additionally, before the battle, Talon Card also supplied the Empress with both a gravity well projector and a series of powerful tractor beams. The battle started with the purposeful leak of the rogue base at Yagdul through Card's agent, who was unaware that her cover had been blown. Isard responded by sending her two final ships, which immediately upon arriving at Yagdul headed towards the station and disgorged their fighters. Rogue Squadron, alongside the Corellian ship and the various freighters, immediately fled the system, but the ISD and the Lusankia were not concerned, as Thyferra did have a local defense fleet. However, as the Lusankia approached the station, Booster Terek demanded that it surrender, turned on the gravity well projector, preventing a jump for hyperspace, and locked the ship with both the powerful tractor beams preventing it from moving and hundreds of fake target locks. The Lusankia, which could be overwhelmed by this amount of firepower, immediately tried to escape but was held in place. That is until the Virulence moved between the station and the tractor beams, allowing the Lusankia to escape, but before it could retrieve its fighters. As the Lusankia completes its 12-hour journey back to Thyferra, Rogue Squadron has arrived alongside the freighters and the war cruiser. However, the Rogues have another ace up their sleeve, the ISD Freedom, which is sitting on System's Edge, ready to enter combat. The Lusankia, again without fighter support, arrives and pushes towards Thyferra, immediately noting the New Republic presence. Local Thyferran Home Defense Corps fighters are also sent from the planet in waves, but the pilots are relatively green and easily fall to Rogue Squadron and their allies. The New Republic/Rogue Squadron plan here is very tricky. They're basically relying on deception and numerical superiority, but also dealing with the fact that no single ship, even the ISD, can survive prolonged fire from the Lusankia. So what we'll see throughout the battle is that they essentially try to cycle whichever target appears deadliest to the Lusankia, thus ensuring that no single element of their fleet is under prolonged fire for too long. The fighters, the ISD Freedom, and the war cruiser attack simultaneously. The Rogues push through several lines of green fighters, while the Freedom aggressively pushes towards the ISD, rolling so its main batteries on both sides can fire at the Lusankia. The Alderaanian war cruiser, which is generally seen as not a threat, positions itself near the Lusankia's engines, away from most of its weapons. Lusankia focuses most of its fire on the Freedom, which is sustaining heavy damage already. Rogue Squadron pushes towards the Super Star Destroyer, relying on the distraction and the fact that they're too small to reliably hit. On their approach, Rogue Squadron notes gun positions on the vessel, and when within optimal firing range, launches proton torpedoes towards a single location. The 20 torps of the squadron wouldn't have been enough to do damage on their own, but to the surprise of the Empire, over 80 missiles and torpedoes hit the Lusankia's starboard side, breaking the shield and impacting the hull. At this point, the Lusankia has nearly crippled the Freedom, but its firepower is drastically reduced as the freighters were also targeting individual gun batteries. Rogue Squadron's strategy is well summed up by this line from the book, which I quite like. As ordered, lead. Korn pulled the trigger on his stick and watched 2 proton torpedoes streak away at their target. pull the Lusankia's fangs and hope we don't get gummed to death on the way out. Seeing the freighters now as the major threat, the Super Star Destroyer shifts fire in their direction, but the rogues continue guiding missile attacks, and the Freedom now is given a chance to recover and also successfully launches a massive broadside, doing serious damage to the now de-shielded Dreadnought. However, things are still fairly up in the air at this point because the freighters are being picked off very quickly, the Freedom itself is heavily damaged, and Rogue Squadron just will not be able to survive indefinitely so close near a Super Star Destroyer. The turning point comes with the appearance of the Virulence, the ISD which had been caught by the tractor beams at Yog Duel. As the Empire celebrated and the rogues prepared to die in a flash of glory, it's revealed that this ship is no longer an Imperial commanded vessel and that it had surrendered to Booster Terek. Additionally, the Virulence is now housing Pash Kraken's A-Wing squadron, which had conveniently been pulled out of hyperspace by the Empress's interdiction field. The Virulence brutalizes the port side of the now shieldless Executor, and the Corellian cruiser, which had been hiding near its rear side, destroys its engines. Elsewhere on the battlefield, Corran Horn's squadron is dispatched to chase down a squadron containing a fleeing Azani Isard, though she would survive. Eventually, Wedge calls the weaponless, shieldless, and defenseless Lusankia and offers surrender. The captain, who had been going more and more mad with power throughout the battle, actually declines and threatens to ram the super ship into Thyferra, but he's killed by an officer on the bridge, and the Lusankia and her crew formally surrender. This is the end of the battle, and it's an amazing victory for the New Republic. And I say New Republic because conveniently Rogue Squadron's resignation is never formally logged. In total, the Rogues lose a couple of fighters, but gain 2 captured Star Destroyers and a Super Star Destroyer. Well, they gain 1 captured Star Destroyer. The Virulence would be kept by Booster Terek, who would rename it the Errant Venture and would turn it into a commercial ship. The Lusankia, on the other hand, would earn its legendary status primarily during the Yuuzhan Vong War, where it would end its life by ramming a Yuuzhan Vong world ship.
As the Battlestars Galactica and Pegasus prepare for open hostilities against each other, Galactica pilot Starbuck returns from an unauthorized recon mission in the custom stealth ship the Blackbird, bringing with her pictures of a large Cylon craft which had previously been identified by Admiral Kane of the Pegasus. The vessel is revealed to be a resurrection ship, one of the key assets used to revive Cylons after their death. The target is nearly impossible to ignore, as its destruction would be a major strategic loss for the Cylons, as well as a drop to morale. Any Cylons killed in action would now face permanent death. Per reconnaissance, the ship is guarded by 2 base stars, a dozen or so support ships, which we don't really see in action, as well as a complement of Cylon raiders. The plan, which is executed to near perfection, is to bait the Cylons into an attack, taking advantage of both Cylon over-aggression and the fact that the fleet is unaware that the Mercury-class Battlestar the Pegasus is not only still operational, but has also joined forces with the Galactica. So here's how it goes down. A small portion of the Colonial fleet, including the Galactica, pretends to be performing mining operations. In reality, they're waiting for discovery by the Cylons. As the attackers enter the system, most of the fleet jumps away, leaving only a few civilian craft which pretend to have FTL engine issues and start running away through real space. Looking to secure kills, the Cylons launch raiders, leaving the base stars and, more importantly, the resurrection ship completely undefended. The Galactica and Pegasus jump in close range to the 2 base stars, while Liadama in the Blackbird disables the resurrection ship's FTL, which was identified in Starbuck's scouting report. With the resurrection ship now unable to retreat, the 2 Battlestars engage the base stars, which, while dangerous when protected by raiders, don't make use of flak weaponry and are vulnerable to close range attack. With the 2 Battlestars at close range, it's more than just relatively one-sided, it's a total slaughter, with both capital ships crippled and presumed destroyed. As this is happening, in an all-or-nothing attack, all available starfighter squadrons are strafing the resurrection ship, which, without any ship-based defensive systems, FTL, or protection from the base stars or the raiders, is a very easy target. With its destruction, all remaining Cylon forces are forced to retreat, having inflicted very few, if any, losses to the Colonial fleet. The Blackbird is disabled after destroying the resurrection ship's FTL, however Liadama is recovered. The battle is notable as it marks one of the first major victories for the Galactica and is a small revenge for the attack on the 12 colonies. All of this, especially the perfect communication and execution of the colonial battle plan, is made even more impressive when one remembers the immense interpersonal strife between the crew of both ships. I mean, both Adama and Kane actually had plans to assassinate each other after the end of the battle. Looking at the losers, this would be a major setback for the Cylons, bringing them some measure of mortality, although only temporarily. They would eventually field other resurrection ships, and the resurrection hub itself still existed, although that too would be taken out, but one can't ignore the immediate change in short-term Cylon strategy, including the loss of 2 base stars and more generally a toning down of aggressiveness. By 9 ABY, the Empire was largely in shambles, with the New Republic now controlling large portions of the galaxy and finally beginning to truly build a functional government. The Empire was losing and near collapse, that is, until Grand Admiral Thrawn joined the battle. Thrawn had been working in the unknown regions, officially trying to bring the various unknown region planets and civilizations into the greater empire, but also secretly creating the Empire of the Hand. More on that in later videos, but what's important is that Thrawn returned from his exodus to launch an extremely complex and sustained campaign against the New Republic, a campaign which threatened to destroy the New Republic itself. But it wouldn't be easy, and although Thrawn had gained the support of the Imperial Ruling Council, which itself controlled a large portion of the loyalist Imperial forces, he had few ships at his disposal, leaving the majority of assets to shore up Imperial borders. He took the Chimera as his flagship, and at most times commanded a fleet of 6 or so ships: the Death's Head, the Judicator, the Inexorable, the Nemesis, and the Stormhawk. However, frequently Star Destroyers would operate independently, especially the Chimera, while on other occasions, of course, like major battles, he would bring more assets to bear. Thrawn's beginning actions were all about testing the New Republic and collecting pieces to the puzzle that would bring them down. One of those pieces was knowledge, and in 9 ABY, he launched a raid against the library world of Abroa Sky, where he discovered, among other things, the location of the Emperor's secret storehouse on the planet Wayland. After the attack, however, the Chimera, which was operating independently, was ambushed by a New Republic task force made up of 4 assault frigates and what the book calls 3 wings of starfighters. Imperial fighter wings are said to be made up of 6 squadrons, while New Republic fighter wings are 3, at least according to later lore. Regardless, Thrawn was outnumbered, with the enemy probably bringing about 100 starfighters and 4 capital ships to bear. At this point, Thrawn was still new to the fleet. He was a mystery to his crew and even the Chimera's captain Pelion, but not only was he one of the legendary Grand Admirals, but even during his exodus had a reputation for being one of the greatest military geniuses ever to serve the Empire, at least among those in the know. So let's talk combat. A single Star Destroyer would probably have a decent chance against the 4 assault frigates. Assault frigates, by the way, are modified and modernized Dreadnought class cruisers. They were about 700 meters long, faster than their base ships with upgraded systems, a lesser crew, but less armor. They seem to be employed very commonly within mobile New Republic task forces during Thrawn's era. The 100 or so X-Wings, on the other hand, were incredibly deadly, most likely capable of destroying multiple Star Destroyers on their own. With the X-Wings considered, it should have been a rout against Thrawn, and Captain Pelion first suggested that the Empire retreat, then later, at the very least, that they call in reinforcements. Thrawn commanded the battle from his personal chambers. On the Chimera, he had replaced a lavish captain's quarters with what was sort of a secondary bridge, which he used to meditate and study art. As the battle began, he was in his quarters, as was Pelion, and he commanded the battle from there. Notably, it was at this time that Pelion and much of the Chimera's crew witnessed Thrawn's pure genius for the first time. At the beginning of the battle, 3 TIE fighters were in a scouting position. Thrawn sacrificed one of these in order to judge how the New Republic commander would respond to threats. Through these actions, he was able to determine that the commander of the fleet was an Elamin, i.e. an alien from Elam. Knowing this, the TIEs pulled back, and Thrawn ordered the Chimera to initiate a Marg Sable. A Marg Sable has a capital ship, in this case the Star Destroyer, orient its bridge towards the enemy while fighters launch unseen from the hangar. The advantage essentially is that the fighters are screened from the enemy, who can't see the formation that they exit in. The typical Marg Sable has them come around various points of the ship and overwhelm the enemy on all sides. At this point we start to lose the specifics, but what we do know is that the X-Wings responded ineffectually, despite the Marg Sable being a fairly common maneuver. Pelion blinked. What in the Empire are they doing? They're trying the only defense they know against a Marg Sable, Thrawn said, and there was no mistaking the satisfaction in his voice, or, to be precise, the only defense they are psychologically capable of attempting. He nodded towards the flashing sphere. You see, Captain, that's an Elam commanding that force, and Elamin simply cannot handle the unstructured attack profile of a properly executed Marg Sable. Most likely what happened is that the X-Wings remained in formation, perhaps heading towards the Star Destroyer, while the TIE fighters came in on their flanks and overwhelmed them from multiple angles. We do know that the TIE fighters were described as sweeping around the Star Destroyer, so I think that's fairly likely. Continuing the assumptions, from that point on, the TIE fighters would have taken the battle to the assault frigates, with the Chimera in support. The Chimera can most likely even outrange the larger ships and certainly has more firepower. Once one or two are lost, it would be an absolute slaughter. However, the specifics so much aren't the key takeaway here. Rather, this is a classic illustration of how Thrawn operates. He is always prepared for his enemy. That preparedness usually identifies some sort of weakness or common behavior which he exploits. Again, although we don't have specifics, because of Thrawn's study of art or perhaps past battles, in this case, he was able to find that the enemy he was encountering was of a certain race, and that this race typically responded a certain way to one type of maneuver. Had the fleet been commanded by humans or some other species, it's very likely that he would have had to retreat or use some other technique. It just so happens that the Marg Sable worked perfectly. In 9 ABY, Grand Admiral Thrawn was waging a devastating campaign against the New Republic. His blitz from the unknown region had pushed the nascent government back onto its heels. The greatest of the Grand Admirals initially utilized a rebel-style stateless strategy, focusing on hit-and-run attacks and raids. This forced the New Republic to spread their military forces out across the galaxy. The worry was that with too many undefended attacks, member worlds would lose faith in the New Republic and would rejoin the Empire. However, after capturing the lion's share of the Katana fleet, Thrawn shifted his focus to reclaiming territory and further re-energizing the Imperial war machine. However, to fuel this next stage of his campaign, Mithra Naruto had to secure resources, while also keeping his fleet on the move and striking back against the New Republic. This brings us to UKIO, which, according to the last command, by the time of the Thrawn campaign was one of the top 5 producers of foodstuffs within the New Republic. What's more, UKIO had heavily developed defense infrastructure, including a planetary shield, ground-based heavy cannons, and several large military installations. Anyone in possession of UKIO with its planetary infrastructure intact could hold it against all but a large planetary invasion. Obviously, this was a goal of Thrawn's. However, at least according to Captain Pelion and Luke Skywalker, conventional wisdom held that it was basically impossible to capture a planet without seriously damaging the shields. The options were, first, in the case where the planetary shield didn't stretch across the whole planet, to land troops outside and wage a drawn-out ground war, or to bombard the shields from orbit, both of which typically resulted in the loss of the precious, expensive, and rare shield generators. Another option was to starve the planet out with a blockade. Even on planets like Coruscant, this took a long time, and UKIO was not only self-sufficient, but a heavy food exporter, so this wasn't feasible. So it's sort of a catch-22. To actually take the planet, you have to destroy that which makes it so valuable, and the New Republic had the exact same issue when trying to capture Imperial Center. However, if there was any being in the galaxy who could change conventional military wisdom, it was Thrawn, and he had secured assets which would allow him to do so. First, over 150 Dreadnoughts of the Katana fleet, powered by Sparati-created clones. Second, a cache of rare Imperial cloaking tech from the Mount Tanta storehouse, with 23 cloaking units fitted for capital ships. Finally, a clone of the Dark Jedi Master Jorah Sabayoth, an expert practitioner of battle meditation. All of this brings us to the Battle of UKIO itself. To keep the New Republic frazzled, Thrawn launched attacks on several planets as he moved a portion of his fleet made up of 2 Imperial Star Destroyers, including the Chimera, and 10 Katana fleet Dreadnoughts into the UKIO system. Ahead of his fleet were covertly disguised freighters, which by all purposes were simple civilian vessels. However, not only were they under Imperial control, but using tow cables, they also pulled 4 cloaked Dreadnoughts. As the fleet moved into position, the UKIO shield began to close, but allowed a small portion to remain open so that any civilian or merchant vessels could get behind the shield and be protected from the fleet. Unbeknownst to the Yukians, this included the Imperial freighters and, more importantly, the cloaked Dreadnoughts. The freighters detached the capital ships and moved to ground, while the Dreadnoughts moved into position within the shield, but in high orbit. At this point, Thrawn threatened the Yukians, who refused to lower their shield, but he responded with a genius trick. Using the battle meditation of Sabaoth, he fired at the planetary shields from his Star Destroyer. As the turbo laser blasts harmlessly collided with the shields, through the use of the Force, Sabaoth coordinated the efforts of the in-shield Dreadnoughts and had them fire at targets on the ground. The timing was so impeccable that it looked like Thrawn hadn't hit the shield, but actually had bombarded the planet, bypassing the shield directly. It took only 2 targeted strikes for UKIO to surrender, ground-based facilities, shield generators, and agricultural assets intact. From that point on, the only concern of Thrawn was making sure landing Imperial vessels didn't actually collide with the Dreadnoughts. This was important because this wasn't a one-off trick, and he was prepared to use this across the galaxy. However, his ploy worked so well that he didn't even need to, as New Republic and neutral worlds capitulated to Imperial rule because of a new, feared superweapon. Combined with shipyards which were now beginning to pump out new Imperial Star Destroyers, his portion of the Katana fleet, and his use of Sabaoth, cloning technology, and cloaking, these new military, industrial, and agricultural centers powered the next stages of Thrawn's campaign. In 9 ABY, the New Republic was in the midst of facing their first great threat, the re-emergence of Grand Admiral Thrawn. Thrawn had reunited and was now leading Imperial forces with exceptional competency, unifying several major warlords and quickly recapturing territory. The first few months of the conflict saw several major New Republic losses, with only a few wins. However, notably, famed rebellion figure Garm Bel Iblis had returned to action and was now stationed on Coruscant. Facilitating Thrawn's rampage across the galaxy was the clone of Dark Jedi Jorah Sabaoth, who was using his Force powers to coordinate Imperial forces. However, the relationship between Thrawn and Sabaoth was very difficult at best, with the crazed Dark Jedi more interested in capturing and converting the Solo children rather than reinstating Imperial rule. This came to a head after a failed kidnapping of the newborn twins on Coruscant, and the 2 men agreed that the most pressing immediate goal was the removal of the New Republic. Sabaoth ordered an attack on Coruscant, and Thrawn agreed. First, as he often did, Myth-Ra Naruto feinted with a fake attack at the planet Mirist. This drew away the core sector fleet, which typically protected Coruscant. The New Republic most likely believed that their capital planet, even without the protective fleet, was untouchable. This would be tested. Thrawn entered the system with 8 interdictor cruisers, with 2 more, plus 8 Katana Dreadnoughts soon following. Immediately, the New Republic sends a recall notice to the sector fleet. However, Imperial forces destroy the sensor relay stations around Coruscant, making any sort of response or follow-up to the SOS impossible. Defensively, Coruscant was protected by 2 Golan 3 platforms, as well as ground-based cannons. Unfortunately, at this point, the Imperial fleet and the Golan cannons themselves were outside the range of the ground-based ion cannons. 6 Star Destroyers would soon appear, splitting up into 2 groups of 3 and heading towards the Golan platforms. At this point, the New Republic was launching their starfighters and gunships, and the smaller Imperial Dreadnoughts and support vessels were moving to escort the Star Destroyers. As the Star Destroyers entered the Golan kill zones and began firing on the massive stations, interdictor cruisers move up to perform what was known as a Thrawn pincer. They activate their gravity well generators, allowing 2 Victory Star Destroyers to make ultra-precise jumps next to the weapons platforms, where they're able to deliver a full broadside, almost piercing the shields. As this is happening, New Republic vessels are attempting to push back the Empire with no effect. Up to this point, the New Republic's response had been led by Admiral Drayson, a respected commander but not near the tactical genius of Thrawn. Eventually, the role shifts to Garm Bel Iblis, who immediately changes strategy. New Republic forces pull back near the planet, where they can be covered by the ion cannon. Bel Iblis knew that they were just wasting ships. Realistically, the Golden Threes could likely withstand an assault for some time, and likely long enough for the Sector fleet to return. Thrawn recognizes the change in strategy and realizes that Garm Bel Iblis probably just took command. That's fine, he decides to implement his ultimate plan. The Star Destroyers open their hangars and launch 22 cloaked asteroids. These asteroids, which are moved into position with the Star Destroyers' tractor beams, begin crashing into ships and enter orbit around the planet. Alongside the real asteroids, Thrawn also fakes the launch of 265 more. However, there's no way for the New Republic to tell which ones are cloaked and which ones just don't exist, because cloaking technology also removes things from sensor readings. So Thrawn effectively blockades Coruscant while using almost no resources. The New Republic is forced to keep the planetary shield up or risk a catastrophic asteroid crash. With the shield up, no one can leave or enter the planet, and there's no real way to quickly destroy the asteroids. This, however, was just one more step in Thrawn's ultimate plan. He knew the New Republic would now need to find the crystal grav field trap, which would be able to identify the cloaked asteroids. This all culminated with the Battle of Bilbringi, where he came very close to landing a death blow against the New Republic.
After the defeat of Grand Admiral Thrawn, the New Republic was really in shambles, and to be honest, so was the rest of the galaxy. One of the final Grand Admirals had re-emerged to unite the fractured Imperial elements before being killed by his own bodyguard at the Battle of Bilbringi, returning the Empire, of course, to chaos. The New Republic too was seriously weakened, but wanted to appear strong, so they decided to immediately launch another campaign against a major Imperial warlord. Their choice was Prince Admiral Delak Krenel of the Ciutric hegemony. Today we'll be covering the final battle of that campaign, the Battle of Ciutric, which saw Admiral Ackbar lead a task force against the Prince Admiral's defensive fleet. So I'm not going to cover all of the details leading up to this battle. We actually covered the book that this campaign appears in, Isard's Revenge, in the most recent episode of TapCaf Transmissions, which is my podcast, so you can check that out if you're interested. But essentially, the Ciutric hegemony was seen as weak enough to fall to the New Republic, and was actually a ripe target because Delak Krenel had participated in the murder of Sate Pestage and had stolen his territory. Krenel meanwhile positioned the hegemony as a sort of bastion for humanocentrism, and was actually working closely with the clone of former head of Imperial Intelligence Izani Isard. The real Isard actually was still alive despite being dead, and came together to work with Rogue Squadron to plan a massive assault against the planet, which would kill Krenel and basically take away the region's capital of Ciutric. Making this all more complicated was the allegation of a hidden, but in reality non-existent superweapon known as Pulsar Station. Anyway, the plan was that the New Republic would get to the planet's surface undetected and undercover. A New Republic fleet would come in and clear out any space forces. Then Imperial commandos supplied by Izani Isard would help take the planet's surface. Now, that last part wouldn't end up happening. Isard would betray the New Republic, but that doesn't really matter because we'll be focusing on the space battle anyway. So, Wedge sent a message to the New Republic telling them to form a fleet and to arrive at Ciutric at a specific point. The New Republic obliged and sent a task force made up of Home 1, of course led by Admiral Ackbar, an Imperial 2 class Star Destroyer, the Emancipator, 3 Nebulon B frigates, and then 6 Corellian corvettes, so a pretty decently sized task force, and exactly what Wedge had asked for. Unfortunately, Krenel was aware of the attack and had massed more defensive forces than expected, including 2 ISD-2s, the Reckoning in the Decisive, an Interdictor Star Destroyer, the Binder, and a Victory Star Destroyer, Emperor's Wisdom. 2 Imps, a Victory, and an Interdictor Star Destroyer meant that the Empire pretty seriously outgunned the New Republic in this case. The Victory Star Destroyer is really what weighed the scales here in the Empire's favor. The ships were not very sophisticated, but especially for their size, they could put out a lot of firepower in the form of both turbo lasers and missiles. Ackbar, knowing that his fleet was outgunned, began a retreat process. The fleet turned away from Ciutric and the defensive forces and headed towards the outside of the gravity well so they could jump to hyperspace. As Ackbar's cruisers began moving, he ordered the smaller ships, including the Nebulon Bs, fighters, CR-90s, and a few smaller freighters, to engage the Victory Star Destroyer, basically so that it couldn't shoot missiles unmolested at the rear of the capital ships. As the fleet retreated, the two Imperial Star Destroyers followed them in sort of a staggered line, with one of them behind the Rebel fleet and the other just off to the side. Krenel ordered both ships to fire on Home 1, however, the Rebel Star Destroyer Emancipator was actually blocking one of the Imperial ships, the Decisive, which was ordered to move laterally into a better position. Still, Home 1 was taking major damage at this point, even just from the rear Star Destroyer, and its rear shields were pierced, with major damage being taken to the hull. However, as the Decisive moved, both Rebel capital ships fired directly on the Reckoning and managed to pierce a portion of that Star Destroyer's shields, doing some damage to its hull as well. However, with the New Republic now close to an escape position, the Empire raised an interdiction field, which is exactly what Admiral Ackbar had been waiting for. As the Reckoning altered position so that its still shielded side would be presented towards the fleet, Ackbar engaged what has been known to the galaxy as a Thrawn pincer. So let's explain this. The basic principle of hyperspace jumps, especially jumps mid-battle, is that there's a high degree of inaccuracy. You don't know how close to your target you'll get, especially in the heat of battle. You could easily miss by thousands of kilometers and just put your ship completely out of position, especially if you're jumping towards a moving target or you're jumping towards forces which are already there. In response, Grand Admiral Thrawn, who played highly on the mechanics of hyperspace during battle, developed the idea of the Thrawn pincer. Basically, he would use an artificially generated gravity well made by an interdictor cruiser or Star Destroyer as a way to pull a ship out of hyperspace. If you imagine an interdiction field projected as a cone, basically he would jump his fleet into the cone, or his ship, and he would basically be able to control which position it exited hyperspace from. Thrawn used this technique at many battles, including his siege on Coruscant, and basically the strength of the Thrawn pincer is that you can put a ship in an extremely unexpected location, catching the enemy totally off guard. Ackbar's use of the Thrawn pincer was unique because he used an enemy interdictor as sort of a hyperspace beacon. And this requires a bit of finagling because typically interdiction cones are deployed away from the cruiser, so if you were to just jump a ship from the same position that the fleet had just come from, it would be pulled out far, far away from the battlefield. So what Ackbar did was essentially have his fleet jump deeper into the solar system, then turn around. When the interdiction field was generated, two Victory Star Destroyers, one of Thrawn's favorite ships for this maneuver by the way, jumped in towards Ciutric and were dragged out of space by the Binder's interdiction field, the Binder being the name of the Star Destroyer. The two Victories immediately launched their entire missile reserves at the Reckoning, which had just adjusted so that its unshielded portion was facing the rear. They devastated the ship, and a stray missile would come to destroy the bridge and kill Delac Krenel. The Decisive and the Binder, which were the ISD and the Interdictor Star Destroyer, were then captured by the New Republic, and the Emperor's Wisdom, which was the Victory Star Destroyer, may too have been captured, though it's not said explicitly in the book. So that's Ackbar's use of the Thrawn pincer, again made unique by the fact that the New Republic didn't actually have an interdictor at this battle, but still with some really classic Thrawn touches, including feinting to get the enemy out of position, then making them pay with Victory Star Destroyers. And again, now we get two more ships for the New Republic fleet, so all around a very successful battle, which of course was also successful on the ground despite the double crossing by Izani Isard.
Admiral Dalla is one of, if not the worst military commanders in all of Star Wars. Every single faction, the Galactic Alliance, the Empire, the Maw Fleet, is made worse by her being in command. Today we'll be doing a quick battle breakdown of Dalla's plans to take Coruscant, which, as you can imagine, were really, really bad. But before we do that, let's take a brief look at her military history up until this point. First of all, I will give her some credit. Dalla is often described as being somewhat of a military prodigy. She was a very successful student while at Carida. However, because she was a woman, she was often passed up for promotions and recognition. However, when she was discovered by Grand Moff Tarkin, and the two also developed a romantic relationship. She was promoted to Admiral, and to my knowledge is the only female Admiral in Star Wars Legends, and was assigned to a top secret Imperial research facility inside the Maw. The Maw installation was a Tarkin project, unsurprisingly researching superweapons. Those within the Maw cluster were sequestered there for over a decade, where they remained completely cut off from galactic events, and Dala didn't do anything to check up with the Empire after being out of contact for so long. She just accepted it as ordinary procedure. Anyway, eventually Han Solo, through a series of events detailed in Book 1 of the Jedi Academy trilogy, discovers the Maw installation and is taken prisoner. Dala learns of the state of the galaxy, the fall of Tarkin and the Empire, and decides to mobilize her forces, made up of 4 Star Destroyers, against the New Republic. However, she also seeks to activate the state-of-the-art weapons kept within the Maw installation, including the Sun Crusher. However, Dala is unable to secure her facility, and the Sun Crusher is stolen. Despite the superweapon being nearly invulnerable, Dala decides to chase it down with the Star Destroyer, which is unsurprisingly destroyed, as the Sun Crusher literally yeets itself through its command bridge. With the loss of the Star Destroyer, Dala decides she still wants to go against the New Republic and starts picking targets at random. Hoping to injure the government, her first target is literally, and I'm not exaggerating, a few hundred settlers on the planet Dantooine. Afterwards, as an Imperial probe droid is reactivated, she decides to attempt attacking Mon Calamari, and of course is outflanked by the far superior Admiral Ackbar, who recognizes her poor tactics immediately, and of course she loses a second Star Destroyer, with her fleet now down to literally half power and having abandoned the Maw installation and its super weapons. That is where Dala comes up for her excellent plan to attack Coruscant, which of course is now the capital of the New Republic and one of, if not the most important planets in literally the entire galaxy. So what's Dala's plan? Well, let's take a look. As a bit of background, Coruscant had just underwent some tough times, being sieged by Grand Admiral Thrawn and being the site of a massive battle during the early stages of Operation Shadow Hand. Though that being said, even Dala acknowledges, and we know from the other Jedi Academy books, that at this point Coruscant was protected by space stocks, space stations, and most likely Golan platforms. It's also, I think, very unlikely that there would not be a fleet in the area. Most importantly, Coruscant was known for having one of the most robust planetary shields in the entire galaxy, and that shield itself is not only a main plot point of the Thrawn trilogy, but also Wedge's gamble, which is all about how to get past the shield generator and take the planet. So what's Dala's plan for taking Coruscant with only 2 Star Destroyers? Well, first off, they'll come out of hyperspace, and then they'll basically just fly straight at the planet and shoot their turbo lasers. I'm not making this up. As we approach in-system, the Basilisk's small volunteer crew will begin a self-destructive countdown. The Gorgon will run interference until we reach our target, at which time we will turn aside. At full speed, the Basilisk will plunge into the atmosphere of Coruscant. It will be unstoppable. Then, basically, the Basilisk will self-destruct, laying waste to Coruscant. And there's only one problem here. That plan is f***ing dumb. First of all, while 2 Star Destroyers is a lot of firepower to throw at a planet like Dantooine, which has no defensive fleet, Coruscant almost certainly has at least some ships defensively, and most likely has Golan defense stations, a local fleet, and most importantly, a planetary shield. She thinks that just because her Star Destroyers have lots of guns, that she can just push through all the New Republic's defenses. Well, I think that's unlikely, especially because 1 Star Destroyer is undermanned, so the turrets won't be nearly as effective. I mean, they come out of hyperspace at Coruscant, and there could be 20 Mon Calamari cruisers and several squadrons of starfighters waiting for them. I don't think that would be strange. What's more, Coruscant has ground-based defenses, it can blow the ships up, and 2 Star Destroyers in the grand scheme of things doesn't represent that much firepower, especially during relatively peaceful times like this, when the New Republic shouldn't have their fleet spread too thinly. But let's just imagine that she's right. She somehow shrugs off all the fire of any ships, any starfighters, any defensive platforms. Well, that still leaves the planetary shield. And we know again from the Thrawn trilogy that planets can get their shields up very, very quickly. And I'm sorry, but one Star Destroyer is not nearly enough to pierce through that. So they try to ram the planet, and they hit the shield, it's game over. Now Dala has one Star Destroyer left, if that one's even able to escape. Does Dala have a plan for the shields? No. And it's not like Star Wars writers at this point didn't understand that shields were a thing, because Book 3 of the Thrawn trilogy, The Last Command, focuses very heavily on Coruscant's planetary shields and how they have to keep it up basically throughout the entire book. Fortunately for Dala, Kip Duron and the Sun Crusher kind of prevented her from attacking Coruscant, but we can cover all of that in a later video if you're interested. Now I know what you're thinking, is it really fair to call this the worst planned battle in all of Star Wars? Well, I think so. There are many battles where there's a clear tactical oversight, or there's a stylistic decision which, when examined logically, really makes no sense, but in this battle, there's a total lack of even a basis for how the Empire and how Dala is going to win. She's not analyzed the situation at all, and as we see throughout the series, she's basically making her decisions purely off a desire to hurt the New Republic rather than any attempt to better the position of the Empire, and that's probably why she ends up losing 3 Star Destroyers. So yeah, Dala is just an unmitigated idiot. I think there's very little redeeming about her from a tactical sense. Many of the books talk about how she's very smart and how she was always overlooked for promotions, but she shows very, very little competence. The only really good thing she does is unify the Imperial warlords later on, but she goes on to lose one more of her Star Destroyers. She loses a Super Star Destroyer when attacking Luke's Jedi Temple, and then many years later when she becomes Chief of State of the Galactic Alliance, she basically tears the government apart and is just doing a really bad job. It's 31 ABY. The New Republic has reorganized into the Galactic Federation of Free Alliances, the Galactic Alliance, and now seeks to reunify a broken galaxy which has been devastated by the Yuuzhan Vong invasion. The Alliance has maintained the New Republic's fleet deployment, with 4 major fleets spread across the galaxy and a 5th roving fleet providing additional security in hot zones. However, the re-emergence of a dark warship on the edge of the galaxy has prompted the creation of a special task force, one which would be organized and put into service off the books. Centering this task force was the Krikana, a massive Viscount-class dreadnought which had protected key New Republic worlds during the Yuuzhan Vong invasion. The Krikana was rumored to have been disabled or destroyed during the end stages of the war, but had been secretly recalled to a deep core shipyard after the Battle of Ebac 9 made the outcome of the war almost certain, at least from a naval standpoint. Why? Well, let me explain. Long before the Yuuzhan Vong War, New Republic vessels told stories of a massive jet-black dreadnought, one which would emerge from hyperspace, obliterating anything in its path. A ship larger than even an Executor Super Star Destroyer. One, curiously, without electronic signature, identification, or purpose. A ghost ship. Everyone assumed it was Imperial, but the dreadnought never made demands or requests before open firing. It just had a penchant for destruction. In 10 ABY, Palpatine re-emerged from the deep core, leading a galaxy-wide invasion as part of Operation Shadow Hand. The New Republic identified Palpatine's second flagship, the Eclipse II Super Star Destroyer, as the Ghost Ship, which had been spotted in the prior year. Both the Eclipse II and her sister ship, the Eclipse, were destroyed during Palpatine's re-emergence, and the threat was thus thought to be over. The New Republic, however, miscalculated. Small details about the flagship Palpatine used, the Eclipse II, were off when compared to the Ghost Ship. Survivors swore that the interior lights of their Eclipse II was different, that it was darker than the one seen during the war, and just that it felt different. However, when the ghost ship did not appear again for over 2 decades, the survivors were generally ignored. However, in 29 ABY, just weeks before the Battle of Yuuzhan Dar, one of the last remaining Vong world ships and its accompanying fleet were devastated by an unknown force near the galactic entry point of Vector Prime. Most suspected the Chiss were responsible, but even among civilians there were rumors that it had been a single massive ship which had levied the destruction. No survivors or even debris from either side were found after the battle. Then, days after the Sequad Accords, which brought an end to the war, a division of the New Republic 3rd Fleet operating on the edge of the Galactic Rim, pacifying Vong holdouts, was similarly wiped out. However, this time a single automated GA ferret survived and sent a vid of the engagement to Alliance High Command. The vid showed a single, black, super dreadnought, easily and thoughtlessly destroying Alliance vessels with unending turbolaser volleys. The attack, of course, came at an incredibly volatile time, as the Alliance and the Imperial Remnant were barely holding the galaxy together, and their alliance as well. After confirming with Galad Pelion that the ghost ship was not one of theirs, which did seem obvious given the Imperial Remnant's limited resources, the GA established a task force to track and destroy the rogue ghost ship. Centering the task force, as I explained, was the Cricana, which most military experts predicted could easily destroy the ghost ship on its own, given the Star Defender's state-of-the-art shielding and weapons. Attached to the Cricana were a variety of vessels, which could be pulled from backwater postings without anyone noticing. They were typically Rebellion-era vessels or early New Republic ships, which had not seen action in some time. The unnamed, off-the-record task force was broken into 2 groups. The Vanguard Group A included the Cricana herself, as well as 2 MC-80s and 2 Corellian corvettes. The smaller capital ships essentially were used to give the first group extra scouting and scanning capacity, with the Cricana offering nearly all of the group's fighting potential. The second group was meant to either reinforce Group A or to engage the ghost ship on its own. It also contained some of the fleet's extra logistic vessels, though the task force was meant to resupply with various covert GA facilities on the rim. Group B was led by an MC-80B, the Mon Astra, and supported by 2 MC-80s, several Corellian corvettes and Nebulon Bs, and various resupply ships. This takes us to the engagement itself. As Group A was plotting a hyperspace jump within the Ilum system merely on a stopover between changing routes, the massive ghost dreadnought which they had been hunting set upon their fleet. The first sign of trouble was that the enemy's jump was far too precise for modern hyperspace technology, especially given the size of the vessel, and assuming of course that the engagement wasn't just a mere coincidence. The Eclipse 2, or whatever it was, immediately launched a devastating ion barrage, which disabled one of the 2 smaller Mon Calamari cruisers. The Viscount and its powerful shields were able to survive this initial barrage and moved into position to guard the more vulnerable ships. However, the disabled Mon Calamari cruiser was quickly and easily destroyed. The more nimble corvettes attempted to outrun the Eclipse's turbolaser tracking, but one of the 2 was destroyed in a single turbolaser blast. The escort fleet immediately began hailing Battle Group 2, while the smaller ships, useless in a fight of this magnitude, moved towards the hyperspace egress points. To cover their retreat, the Viscount tilted its nose up towards the Eclipse while delivering a massive broadside barrage. Both vessels were able to pierce holes in their opponent's shields, though due to the thick and redundant hull of both ships, neither initially could land a serious blow. The Mon Calamari admiral commanding the Cricana sought to take advantage of the weakness of all Star Destroyers, and that is the ship's dedication to a powerful forward-facing firing arc to the expense especially of rear turbolaser coverage. Knowing that the Star Defender could move itself into an advantageous position, and that the nearby second battle group would be arriving shortly, the Cricana moved towards the Dreadnought's engines, not only to minimize the damage that it took, but also so could potentially prevent escape. The ghost ship, however, had a similar idea. It was armed with a heavy-duty turbolaser turbo laser battery, the kind usually only seen dirt side and connected to an entire planet's worth of energy. The weapon was able to ravage the Crocana's engine, and the massive Star Defender lost the ability to maneuver, and she was essentially dead in the water. The Eclipse 2 had also suffered some serious structural damage through the brawl, but was able to maneuver in a position where it could use its other unknown weapon, a powerful super laser which destroyed the Crocana in a single, simple, beautiful blast. However, the Dreadnought now was not only limping with its shields and systems failing, but having expended incredible amounts of power during the broadside and super laser firings, is unable to retreat as the second GA battle group appears within their hyperspace lane. Immediately, knowing that their old ancient cruisers could not hope to stand up to the ghost ship in a brawl, Group B launched their fighters, with brave pilots heading directly towards the Super Dreadnought, each hoping to add a ghost ship kill to the hull of their fighter. It's at this point that we lose the plot, and we're unclear what has happened. So there was one key to this battle here, and that's the unknown technology of the Eclipse. During Operation Shadow Hand, the Eclipse 2 saw only a moderate amount of action. It's unclear whether the two vessels actually had a super laser, but unlike the ghost ship, they did not use it, which is why the New Republic did not expect to get hit with such a massive energy weapon. Similarly, although they knew the Dark Empire had incredible technology, and technology that was generally a level above theirs, the New Republic was not expecting this ship to have such powerful ship-based power generation and such devastating weapons. We still know little about the motivations of the ghost ship, who it serves, what faction it's attached to, what vessel it really is, but arguably the shock and awe factor of coming out of hyperspace so close to the GA fleet, and even the guaranteed kills it scored on the two smaller vessels, was not worth taking so long to actually kill the Viscount. We know that the Eclipse models did have internal interdictor fields. Perhaps the Eclipse was unable to use those because it needed more energy for its shield and weapons. Maybe then it attacked so closely because it wanted no survivors and wanted to wipe out the fleet in one fell swoop. And that's the breakdown